Enter the event panelist numeric password.
Okay, Rules Committee will come to order. Though we're going to be meeting on a handful of bills, two measures will dominate our time today. Both take steps to strengthen the United States economy. The Biden-Harris administration has helped our economy recover from the COVID crisis by getting Americans back to work. As a result, reports show that we have record low unemployment and record job growth. Yet job openings exceed the number of applicants, and employers are clamoring for skilled workers. While the U.S. labor force has grown by roughly half over the last 40 years, federal spending on workforce development has fallen by 2/3. In 2020, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIA, expired. This law is the backbone of our nation's workforce development system, providing important skill-building services to workers and people looking to enter America's labor force. Yet, chronic underfunding of the WIA programs means that demand for services far outpaces availability. H.R. 7307, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2022, will reauthorize the program and expand access to high-quality job training and career navigation services, giving hardworking Americans the opportunity to grow their professional capacity and hone their skills benefits employees, employers, and the economy. Our bill will advance the domestic economy and reinforce our economic competitiveness globally. It's a good bill and should be widely supported. Now, in addition to uplifting the workforce, we understand that strengthening the economy also means that we must alleviate the rising costs consumers face daily, particularly prices at the pump. Look, Americans know that supporting Ukraine will require some sacrifices, especially regarding oil and gas costs. Neither the President nor Congress sets global gas prices, but that doesn't mean Congress shouldn't do everything in its power to alleviate the high costs American families are facing at the pump. We know big oil is raking in record profits, taking advantage of the current international crisis and consumer demand to generate greater returns and enrich shareholders. These unscrupulous practices must stop. H.R. 7688, the Consumer Fuel Price Gouging Prevention Act, would make it unlawful to increase gasoline and home energy fuel prices in an excessive or exploitive manner. I hope my friends on both sides of the aisle will join us in supporting H.R. 7688 to deliver relief to American families. Let me just say before I yield to the ranking member, I also hope that this is an opportunity for us to come together as a nation, Democrats and Republicans, to actually invest more substantially in alternatives to fossil fuels. I mean, this is not the first time we've had a crisis like this, and yet, you know, we continue to do the same old, same old, same old, and these big oil companies continue to make money no matter what the situation is, and so this is an opportunity, maybe, as we talk about how we alleviate some of the pressures on the American people in the short term, how maybe we think a little bit more in the longer term about what we want our future to look like. I don't want to continue to have to rely on big oil companies for our energy, and I think, you know, people have been warning about this for a long, long time, and yet for whatever reason we can't seem to get our act together in a bipartisan way to move to pursue cleaner, greener, renewable energy. But whatever, we have a short-term crisis that we need to get through, and that's what today is about. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, our hearing today covers two items. The first I'll discuss is H.R. 7309, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2022. Unfortunately, today's hearing represents yet another missed opportunity for bipartisanship. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA, has historically been reauthorized on a bipartisan basis, and there certainly is an appetite among Republicans to do so again. But instead of putting forward a bipartisan measure that builds upon the last reauthorization, providing needed reforms and more flexibility to states, employers and employees, the majority has instead chosen to move forward with a partisan measure. And what's worse, it's a partisan measure that rolls back previous reforms in WIOA. If the majority has its way, it will impose a one-size-fits-all structure from Washington that will limit or remove a vast majority of the flexibility for states. The majority's bill will impose onerous reporting requirements on the states that will waste time, money, and resources that could be better used getting people back to work. And instead of focusing on connecting job creators with job seekers and helping people build up their skills, it will force states to spend their time responding to commands from federal bureaucrats here in Washington. Mr. Chairman, it's disappointing that the majority is not putting forward a bipartisan bill today. This is certainly an area where Republicans and Democrats have shared goals. When people join or return to the workforce, or gain skills needed for better, higher-paying jobs, we all win. Taxpayers win, job seekers win, employers win. And on a topic that is so beneficial for the entire country, and on which there's so much agreement between Democrats and Republicans, it's disheartening that we are not considering a bipartisan bill today. Our second bill, H.R. 7688, the Consumer Fuel Price Gouging Prevention Act. The majority claims this bill is intended to address spiraling gas and diesel prices. But the reality is that this bill is a smokescreen intended only to deflect away from the failed policies of the Biden administration that led us to this point. Consider what this bill does. It gives the Federal Trade Commission the authority to go after alleged, quote, price gouging, unquote, in the consumer fuel market. But unfortunately for the majority, the Federal Trade Commission already has this authority. And today's bill, even if enacted into law, would do nothing that the FTC cannot already do. But consider what the bill does not do. It doesn't add new sources of energy to help bring prices down. It doesn't fully open up federal lands to oil and gas drilling, which President Biden single-handedly stopped earlier in his administration. It doesn't restart the Keystone XL pipeline, which would have brought 830 barrels of oil per day to American oil refineries. It doesn't stop the administration from prioritizing buying oil from adversarial countries like Russia and Venezuela over developing our own domestic energy resources, and does nothing to ensure that America has an all-the-above energy policy to secure American energy independence. Mr. Chairman, it's unfortunate that a bill this weak and this pointless is all that the majority can offer. American consumers are hurting right now. They are being hit every day with a double whammy of rising inflation and rising gas prices. It's becoming harder and harder for working families to make it between rising food prices, rising fuel prices, and the steadily eroding buying power of wages. We can and should be doing all we can to expand energy supplies to bring prices down and reduce pain at the gas pump and at the grocery store. Instead, all we have to consider is this pathetic fig leaf of a bill that will do absolutely nothing to solve this crisis. It's a sad state of affairs, Mr. Chairman. We must do better than this. The American people expect no less. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm now happy to welcome our two witnesses, the Chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Pallone. Thank you for being with us, and Ranking Member McMorris Rogers is here as well. So let me yield to Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Cole, and all the members of the Rules Committee. I'm just going to give you a kind of 30-second summary of what the bill does, and then I'll try to elaborate a little bit, but not too much. Basically, what it does is gives the FTC new authority, and I would disagree with the Ranking Member because it is new, to address gas price gouging, wholesale and retail. Basically, the president would declare an energy emergency, and that would make it unlawful to increase gas and home energy fuel prices in an excessive or exploitative manner. And the FTC does not have the authority to do that. This energy emergency would have to be declared, in which case the FTC would have this additional authority. Now, let me just say, Mr. Chairman, we had a hearing in the Energy and Commerce Committee about a month ago, and it's quite clear that big oil is ripping off the American people. They're taking advantage of the instability caused by Russia's unjust war in Ukraine and our ongoing economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic to rake in record profits. And meanwhile, everyday Americans are struggling to afford the cost of filling up their tanks to get to work and drop their kids off to school. And I believe it's time for Congress to take what I consider bold action, I do think this is significant, to protect consumers and put an end to this profiteering. Now, I mentioned the hearing last month. We had the leaders of 6 oil companies, and we asked them, we took a hard look, if you will, at their business practices and the industry's role in rising gas prices. And what we found was alarming. They are purposely keeping production low in order to keep prices and their profits high, And the result is they're making a fortune. In 2021, Shell brought in over $19 billion in profits, an 8-year high. And so far this year, they've already hit another record high with over $9 billion in profits in just the first quarter. The industry's been very clear about what's driving these record profits. They're not saying anything differently. On a shareholder call earlier this year, the CEO of Shell bragged that because of the war in Ukraine, the company was enjoying, and I'm quoting, better performance, and yes, indeed, our shareholders will benefit from that as well. And it's not just one company. We're seeing these trends across the market. ExxonMobil increased profits to $5.4 billion in the first quarter of the year, despite halting its operations in Russia. BP's quarterly profit reached $6.2 billion, its highest in more than a decade, with their CEO calling the company a, quote, cash machine. And while these companies are making record profits, they're refusing to increase production. I keep saying increased production is the answer here, but they're not doing it. They're intentionally keeping supply artificially low and prices at the pump high instead of a traditional supply and demand economic model, which is what you would think would happen in a capitalist society, where we'd expect to see these companies ramping up production to meet rising demand. They're instead using their profits to buy back stock to further increase executive and shareholder profits, and they're ensuring the rich get richer at everyone else's expense. Now, I've heard Mr. Cullen, I'm sure I'm going to hear others on the Republican side, say that somehow government regulation is at fault for rising prices. Well, we didn't hear that at the hearing. Actually, I have some statistic here that says that only 6% of oil companies surveyed in a recent survey indicated that government regulations are impeding oil production. The oil and gas industry has more than 9,000 approved but unused drilling permits because they don't want to ramp up production. The fossil fuel industry also controls over 26 million acres of U.S. public lands, but 53% is not being used to produce oil and gas. And if the numbers don't speak for themselves, the big oil executives are telling us exactly why they're suppressing supply. When asked in a recent survey why they're restraining growth despite high oil prices, nearly 60% of executives said that pressure to maintain capital discipline is the primary reason that they're not increasing production. So, Mr. Chairman, the problem is not government regulation. I'm going to keep saying it throughout this hearing. The problem is big oil is keeping supply artificially low so prices and profits stay high. Now, I think that when the market is broken, that's when Congress has to step in to protect American consumers, and that's what this bill does. It empowers the FTC to go after the gougers and empowers the agency to effectively monitor and report on market manipulation. So I'm not going to get into it. I've already told you, my sort of capsule summary about what the bill does. But I did want to say the legislation would direct collected penalties to a consumer relief trust fund, which can be used for the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, LIHEAP, and the Weatherization Assistance Program to further lower costs for consumers. It also empowers states to go after price gougers, and it tries to protect independently owned gas stations and shield them from taking the blame for price gouging at the wholesale level or increased costs throughout the supply chain. Now, the last thing I wanted to say is we have a manager's amendment that incorporates provisions championed by Senate Commerce Chairwoman Maria Cantwell. And these provisions are intended to strengthen government oversight of the fuel markets and enhance the FTC's authority to go after market manipulators. So this is different than the original bill. And that amendment bolsters FTC's authority to crack down on fuel market manipulation and doubles the maximum penalty for manipulation wholesale oil markets. It also includes provisions that would improve market transparency and competition by directing the Energy Information Administration to collect and publish information related to the quantity and pricing of transportation fuels. So let me just say, we cannot allow big oil to continue to rip off the American people. This bill will make a difference, and I just want to thank you again for the opportunity to be heard on it. But you're going to hear me over and over again say, this is not government regulation that is the problem. It's the opposite. They're gouging. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Ranking Member McMorris-Rogers, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. America's in crisis. Store shelves are empty. New mothers can't find formula for their babies. Overdose deaths continue to rise as deadly fentanyl pours across the southern border. Inflation is out of control and gas prices continue to reach record levels. And here we go again. We're in front of the rules. Thank you. Oh, I have to start all over. You've already heard enough. Time and time again, we're hearing that the answer to the inflation crisis is more government control, more government spending, and less freedom. The disastrous consequences that price controls will have are not hypothetical. We've seen it before. These are the policies that are used in Soviet Russia, Venezuela, North Korea, and other dictatorships. They lead to massive shortages in goods, which result in economic and humanitarian devastation. The United States even tried to control the high gas prices and inflation through price controls in the 1970s. This led to shortages, rationing, mile-long gas lines, many of us remember from the Carter years, and made us dangerously dependent upon OPEC. The 1970s appear to be here again. Democrats are following the lead of Soviet Russia, Venezuela, and failing to learn from our own history. It is a big distraction. It's a very big distraction from the policies that have led us to where we are here today. And yet the president and the administration are continuing full speed ahead, shutting down American energy. In March 2020, then candidate Joe Biden said, quote, "No more subsidies for fossil fuel industry, no more drilling on federal lands, no more drilling, including offshore, no ability for the oil industry to continue, period." President Biden put in place a moratorium on new drilling. In May of 2020, candidate Joe Biden pledged to stop the Keystone XL pipeline, and he did so on day one. And just last week, the administration canceled lease sales for millions of acres of oil and natural gas production in Alaska and in the Gulf Coast of Mexico. We have been sounding the alarm. The Republicans have been warning of these disastrous policies and that the impact that they are going to have on energy and gas prices. And we are seeing that direct result today. There are solutions. We do not, from day one, we've seen gas prices going up since President Biden took office. I'm leading with Bruce Westerman, who's the ranking Republican on the Resources Committee on legislation. It is the American Energy Independence from Russia Act. It would lower cost, and it would protect our national security. It would flip the switch on so that we could produce here in the United States. It removes all barriers to LNG exports. It unlocks America's energy potential by requiring leasing and permitting of energy and mineral development on federal lands and waters. It would immediately approve the Keystone XL pipeline, force the DOE secretary to have a plan to increase domestic production before allowing any more of the non-emergency withdrawals from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. We are on track to be down at 100 million barrels, enough to last about a week. Democrats, unfortunately, keep blocking this solution. 5 times they have blocked the vote to increase domestic production, to lower costs and boost energy exports, to help our allies counter President Putin's aggression. Let's focus on what's actually going to get results. Let's stop shifting the blame now to price gouging. First, the administration tried to blame Putin. They called it the Putin price price hike. But anyone who's been trying to fill up their gasoline tank since January knows it's not true. When President Biden took office, average gas price was $2.38. And then it climbed to over a dollar increase even before President Putin invaded Ukraine. The American people are smart. They're not falling for this. So now we have the president shifting the blame to industry, alleging price gouging. Now, unless you ask his energy secretary, who just recently in front of the committee said, quote, "I'm not sure anyone is saying there is wholesale gouging." That was just a few hours after the plan to introduce the legislation that we have before us today. So it seems like there's a little bit of confusion there. The Federal Trade Commission has investigated price gouging in oil and gas markets for over 100 years, and they've never found systemic price gouging. They found higher prices are in relationship to the supply and demand. Americans are experiencing higher prices for virtually every single good and service, including gas. And this is not because of some grand conspiracy that companies have suddenly decided to charge unaffordable prices. We need to stop the madness. But yet we see Senator Warren and several House members introducing legislation that would impose price controls on our entire economy. The United States of America, under a capitalist system, free markets, has done more to lift people out of poverty, raise the standard of living more than any other nation in the world. That's the promise of America. It's free enterprise, not socialism, not government price controls. It's free enterprise that has proven the best way to restore prosperity and optimism for hardworking people of this country. So I reject this legislation. Let's abandon this government price control scheme. Let's unleash American energy. Bring down gas prices. Bring hope to hardworking American families. And I yield.
Thank you very much. And, it's really, I just have to say personally kind of disappointing that every time we have these conversations, we begin with, Soviet Russia and socialism and all that kind of stuff. But since you wanted to go down that way, let me read something that's been bothering me all weekend about what's happening in this country and the direction this country is going in with what happened in Buffalo. Let me read the tweet from Liz Cheney, a member of the Republican Party. It says, the House GOP leadership has enabled white nationalism, white supremacy, and anti-Semitism. History has taught us that what begins with words ends in far worse. GOP leaders must renounce and reject these views and those who hold them. And I bring it up because I think you've helped set the tone for this hearing today with some of your rhetoric. I mean, the bottom line is that, America is in crisis. We're about to lose our democracy, and we're going in directions, quite frankly, that a few years ago, I think none of us ever contemplated that we would be faced with some of the things that we're now dealing with. And that it should be a wake-up call to everybody. And let me just also say, there's no denying a point that Mr. Pallone made, that oil companies are making record profits. They're making a lot of money. And if you don't believe me, you could believe the reporting of what goes on in their shareholders' meetings. I mean, they're giddy over all the money that they're making, and they're not producing anymore. They're just charging more. Everyone understands the relationship between supply and demand. And I, for one, do not want to use this moment, yet another crisis with the fossil fuel industry, to be an excuse to, give them their wish list, everything they want. You talk about the Keystone Pipeline. Well, I mean, first of all, that's nowhere near being built. But if it was built, it would probably lower prices. It would lower prices by pennies on the gallon. That's what we're told. I think you get more off if you belong to a supermarket rewards program than you would if we invested all the gazillions of dollars in constructing the Keystone Pipeline. But does anybody, I mean, Mr. Rogers, do you disagree that oil companies are making lots of money right now?
Well, I cited the Secretary of Energy just 2 weeks ago in front of the committee.
Did
She
the
was
Secretary of
asked that
Energy-
question about
Did
if
the
there
Secretary of
was...
Energy say that oil companies are losing money?
She said that she did not know, she did not think anyone was talking about massive, widespread price gouging.
I think their profits are pretty well known. They're published. It's not like a secret. I mean, it's not my conclusion. And so it is, I just want to make sure I'm clear on this, and so it'd be helpful to just get this on the record. So your position is that big oil bears no responsibility whatsoever for higher prices at the gas pump.
My position is that the administration,
It's
since
either a yes or
day
no.
one,
It's either a yes or
since
no.
day one, has been implementing policies that are shutting down American energy. It started on day one with the Keystone Pipeline. It has continued.
That's not the question. My question
the
is,
message-
my question is it your position that big oil companies bear no responsibility whatsoever for the higher prices that people are paying at the pump.
My position is I would like to see the Biden administration and the Democrats bear some responsibility for the policies that they are imposing that are contributing to shutting down
Well,
American energy and therefore driving up prices.
That was a yes or no question, and I guess you don't want to answer it, but the bottom line is this month Shell announced a record-breaking $9.1 billion in quarterly profits, while ExxonMobil and Chevron recently pledged to use their high revenues to enrich shareholders through stock buybacks instead of providing relief at the pump for hardworking American families. That's what they said. So we can argue about whether you want to continue to provide giveaways to the fossil fuel industry. We could have a debate over whether that's the direction we got to go or something else. But I mean, they are clear about that they don't seem to give a damn about what people pay at the pump. I mean, they've made it clear. These are their words, right? And yet, this idea that somehow they have no responsibility. I get it. Corporations want to make money, but you would think at a time when we are dealing with a maniac like Vladimir Putin, who has launched this horrific invasion into Ukraine, which has not only resulted in higher energy prices, but higher food prices because of the breadbasket of the world, and he's cut off their ability to be able to sell food to the rest of the world. I mean, you would think at this point that everybody would, including big corporations, including big oil companies, would think that maybe this is a time when, I'm not even saying that they should not make profit. I'm just saying that they shouldn't make as much profit, that there ought to be, I don't know, maybe some inkling of patriotism within them to say, we want to help get through this crisis until things stabilize, and then we can go on. But they're not. They're bragging about all the money they're making. I mean, my father used to have a saying. He says, there's a fine line between being a good guy and a goddamn fool. If we're sitting here saying that oil companies, when they brag openly about all the profits that they're making, they're giddy about it, somehow have no impact at all on what people pay at the pump, I have to tell you, that doesn't even pass the laugh test, in my opinion. I mean, we can argue about, if you want Keystone Pipeline, you could make that case, which is years away, and again, we know it will make little difference at the pump, even if it was up and running right now. We could argue over whether the future is more fossil fuels or more clean, green, renewable energy, which I want. We could have that argument. But in this moment, right now, to suggest that somehow big oil should get a free pass, they have nothing to do with any of this stuff, they can't impact the price at the pump, I mean, give me a break. I mean, people get it. And people are hurting because of it. And by the way, not just people who drive back and forth to work, but I mean, people who want to heat their homes, farmers are struggling. I mean, everybody is struggling. So I'm just like, you can go down the road of Soviet socialism and all that other stuff. I mean, at the end of the day, at some point, we have to call these corporations out. I'm not saying that's the only thing we need to do, but to suggest that at a time when they're making record profits, and as I pointed out, that they pledge to use their high revenues to enrich their shareholders through stock buybacks, that doesn't bother anybody. I don't know. It bothers me. And so, I mean, I think this is the right thing to do, and I hope we move something forward, and we'll see whether we do or not. Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record 2 articles: how gas prices controls sparked 70 shortages by the Washington Times, and the second article by CNN Business, should the government control the price of food and gas?
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. With all due respect, you know how many barrels this country was producing in 2005 and 6? About 5.8 million. You know what they're doing today? Over 11. And frankly, it peaked at over 13. with all due respect, those of you that aren't from energy-producing states ought to come down and see how it's done sometime, and see the thousands of people involved in it that work hard. And by the way, those companies were all losing money in 2020 and 2021, billions and billions of dollars. Please, don't lecture me on people that I know personally and that I know put the good of the country first and run enormous risks. Your own party wouldn't fill up the Strategic Petroleum Reserve when President Trump was in office and the industry was flat on its back. So, well, why don't we buy it cheap now, fill it up? Could have sold it all back right now, but no, that wasn't done because that was going to help the evil fossil fuel industry. I mean, you're just flat wrong on this. And I come from a state that believes in green energy too. We're second in the country in terms of the percentage of our electricity that comes from wind, 42%. I'd like to see some of the other states match that. So I'm not against green energy. I'm for energy that makes sense. And frankly, right now, we have an administration that has pursued policies, and the lead time to produce, is not a matter of days. You don't turn it on like a switch. It's years to bring on, build the pipeline, find the production, move it to market. When you destroy the capacity, then don't be surprised that the policies lead to higher prices at the pump. As a matter of fact, quite often I've heard my friends say, gosh, I wish gasoline was more expensive, because that way that would facilitate the move to green energy. You can't have it both ways. So let's just follow good economic policies. Let me start with my good friend from Washington, Mr. McMorris Rogers. Just to get the record clear, has the bill before us received a legislative hearing or a markup?
No.
No, okay. Did you have the opportunity to provide any input in the drafting of this legislation before it came before the Rules Committee today?
No, we did not.
Okay. Did your committee have any opportunity to discuss with relevant stakeholders the impact of this legislation may have on them before today?
No.
No, that's what I thought. Do you share my concerns that the Speaker's bringing up a bill that is such a departure from normal, regular order? You normally have lots of hearings, you'd have a debate, you'd have amendments. What we're getting here really hasn't gone through the legislative process. Is that fair to say?
I do share your concern. It's irresponsible. And one thing about the Energy and Commerce Committee, it's a committee that has a rich history of being a committee that addresses some of the most difficult issues facing the country, and rising gas prices is absolutely one of the biggest issues facing hardworking Americans right now. This bill, unfortunately, will do nothing to actually bring down the cost of gas prices for hardworking Americans.
As you said in your opening remarks, the claim that oil and gas companies are actively engaged in price gouging seems dubious at best. Can you please expand upon those falsehoods that have led to this claim?
This is a claim that often comes up by our friends on the left. It's been looked into over the decades, over 100 years ago. I have this, it's from Tulsa World. That might be from your neck of the woods, actually, where they were investigating this claim of widespread price gouging by oil companies through the years, in the 70s again. There's not the evidence that the proponents of this legislation want to suggest, and they're failing to acknowledge or take any responsibility for the policies that they're imposing, shutting down American energy, the infrastructure, the pipelines that are foundational to American energy, which is so important, not just to our economy, but our national security, and pushing back right now on President Putin.
Let me turn to my friend, Mr. Pallone, Chairman Pallone. Does this legislation gives the FEC authority to impart penalties if it deems prices unconscionably excessive?
I don't know, maybe it doesn't matter.
If it's green, it's on.
Oh, there you go. I think the answer is yes. I mean, basically what it says is that the president would declare an emergency, and in that emergency, they could not charge excessive prices or, market, and we would also go after any kind of market manipulation.
Okay, is that term defined, what excessive prices are? Because they're cheaper here than they are in Europe. They're cheaper than they are in most places in the world still, even after the price increases.
I don't think the bill defines it. I have it in front of me, but I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think it does either. Ms. McMorris-Rogers, so the FTC can determine what's an excessive price based on their own interpretation. You share my concerns, that's pretty vague.
Yes, it's very broad. It would be great authority to the FTC, and that's why to the chairman's point, I have concerns that this is a way a socialist government addresses an issue like this, that they come and they impose a price on what you can charge, and in this case, it would be gasoline, but and what they do is they would say that the president would have to declare that we have an energy emergency. It makes you wonder what other things they might impose through their energy emergency.
Mr. Cole, could I?
Yeah, please, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I did want to say it doesn't define it per se, but you mentioned, does it define exploitation and excessive prices? It doesn't define it per se, but it has these aggregating factors. It says whether the amount charged by such person grossly exceeds the average price at which a consumer fuel was offered for sale 30 days prior thereto. It looks at various benchmarks to determine those.
We're going to do that to farmers too. Last time I looked, food was up. They are
have
farmers,
farmers
the farmers and ranchers of America actively gouging the consumers of America? I don't think so.
Well, look, let me say this. I think what I want you to understand is the idea is that we have this energy emergency because of the high prices, and the bill's trying to say that in that circumstances, exploitation and manipulation should not be allowed. Now, I know you said previously, well, they can do that anyway, but that's not really the case in all honesty. This says that during this emergency, we can pay particular attention to excessive prices, exploitation, and manipulation, and it does attempt to show what those aggravating factors are.
Can you give us a list of companies or people that you think are actively gouging the American people?
Oh, I don't think there's any question that manipulation is going on.
Want to just list them out, who these people are?
Well, I mean, every day there's more and more information.
Were they gouging when prices went down, 5, 6 years ago dramatically? Or do they just operating according to market conditions?
Well, you can say, look, let me say this. Mrs. Rogers has said that this is price control, and you and her are both talking about how we shouldn't be setting prices or trying to control prices or whatever it is. But the basic idea here is that we're in an energy crisis, and in this, we're not controlling prices, but we are saying that if they're excessive, and if it's an effort essentially to gouge because you're making a lot of huge amounts of money, that we can step in because essentially it's like a monopoly. And we should be able to step in and say, you can't do this in this circumstances because of the problem.
Forgive me, but Ms. McMorris-Rogers is not old enough to remember, but I am old enough to remember the 1970s. I watched this kind of legislative, regime imposed, and it didn't do anything. It just raised prices further and constricted supply further. But we'll see. If they get this power, we'll see if they go out and actually use this to find anybody that price gouged. My guess is they're not going to find anybody, and they certainly aren't going to find it on an industry-wide basis, where you sit here and name company after company after company, that they all are in some vast conspiracy to charge, unrealistic prices. I just don't think that's likely to be the case, but we'll see. Ms. McMorris-Rogers, let me go to you. If you actually have legislation that I think H.R. 6858 would actually accomplish the goal of trying to lower energy prices. Could you expand a little bit on that and what's in that legislation?
Sure, I appreciate the question, and I just want to say that when President Biden was elected, I want to reinforce this point, gas prices were $2.38 a gallon. And even a year later, they had already gone up on average over $1, and that was before President Putin and his aggression in the Ukraine and we're seeing gas prices go up even further. The legislation is the American energy independence from Russia. And we know that one of our strongest weapons against President Putin and his aggression in Ukraine is to unleash American energy. And it would have the positive of pushing back on his aggression and bringing down gas prices. Because if we say yes to American energy, so the legislation would approve the Keystone Pipeline, it would approve LNG exports, it would address the permits on federal lands that this administration continues to shut down, just recently in Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico. It also, we've worked with Bruce Westerman and the Resources Committee to address the critical minerals. And again, we see the administration shutting down mines right now. I know it's not directly related to gas, but it's all part of the infrastructure that that is needed to produce energy, to make America energy independent. And this is legislation that I believe we should be moving right now. It's one of the best things that we could do.
I represent a district that has produced more energy than it's used for well over 100 years, in a state that's done exactly the same thing. And I know how much work and how hard it is. Every little machine shop, every small oil and gas thing, what it takes to keep stripper wells that produce less than 10 barrels a day in existence on very thin profit margins. And I know what this industry's done in more than doubling American domestic production in the last 15 years, more than doubling. And how that brought down prices from 07 and 08 down to where they were in 2019, 2020. And I see a different regulatory regime coming in, and lo and behold, as you point out, immediately prices start moving up. Maybe we ought to look at some of the things the federal government does and does not do, since it has such enormous control over the marketplace. But let me just end with this. Again, I guess I take this a little more personally because I have thousands of constituents involved in this industry. Every time I see the price of shrimp go up or lobster, I don't attack fishermen in Maine or Massachusetts. I don't say that they somehow are price gouging. I just figure they're probably dealing with a market situation and doing the best they can. And again, to attack an industry that's made this country practically energy independent from where it was in the 1970s, and where I've literally watched people lose their jobs, watch companies shut down, watch them disappear, and say, oh, what, now they're somehow gouging people. Just not the case. That's not the way the economy works. That's not the way the industry works. And again, I would just, if anybody's got all this evidence of price gouging, I want to see it because they haven't produced it. And we have plenty of regulatory agencies that have the authority to prosecute. They haven't gone out and prosecuted. This idea of just look in the mirror, look at the policies you're pursuing. And, again, plenty of people on the left openly say, we like higher gas prices because it speeds the transition to green energy. If that's the case, you've got what you want. You certainly have gotten what your policies have put out there. But again, I've got thousands of constituents involved in this business, not hundreds and not a few at the top, thousands. And to basically smear them with the charge that they are gouging the American public and they're trying to manipulate the market. You're basically making that charge at people up and down the line involved in the production of this stuff. And I can assure you, they don't share your opinion. And if you got evidence of it, I'll be very anxious to see it actually produced. With that, thank you for indulging me, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
No, thank you. And I just want to, I want to say a word in defense of our farmers and those who our fisheries, those who are fishermen, those who are the lobstermen and women. They're not making record profits right now. Our farmers are not making record profits. So they're not making record profits and artificially inflating the price of food, passing it on to consumers. In the case of those who are lobstermen and women, I mean, their issue is climate change is adversely impacting their livelihood in a very, very serious way. So it's not because they're just charging more for the hell of it. I mean, and I would also say, I mean, Mr. Morris Rogers, you had said a couple of times, you kept on referring to these price gouging, initiatives as being socialist. Do you think price gouging laws are socialist in general?
I don't,
Because there are 42 states
Yes.
in this country, including Oklahoma, that have price gouging laws. And I'm not going to say that Oklahoma is a socialist state. I don't think that's the case. But they have them for a reason.
Sure.
Because there are players out there that gouge and stick it to average citizens. They're there for a reason. And I think, again, I don't think it is somehow beyond the pale to be questioning at a time when oil companies are making record profits, when they are bragging about it on their shareholders' meetings, when they are talking openly about not passing on any relief to consumers, but in fact enriching their shareholders, to say, I mean, is this appropriate? And can things be done better? So this is not about a socialist model. It is about making sure the American people don't get screwed. That's the bottom line.
can I respond?
Yeah.
I would, price caps are the part that is socialist. When the federal government comes along and starts telling an industry or a company what you can charge, that is socialist. And I was here not too long ago, it was on prescription drugs. I feel like it's kind of deja vu, where again, the majority was coming in wanting to impose price caps. Yes, there's laws, we don't want people gouging. And the FTC has investigated gouging. There's over decades, I referenced that, where for oil and gas too, they have done investigations and they've not found the widespread price gouging that the majority right now is suggesting is happening in this industry at this time, that is all of a sudden bringing up the cost of gasoline and my point is that the majority is failing to acknowledge what is actually happening, the impact of the policies that are shutting down the industry.
Where are the price caps in the bill?
It would, through an emergency, what the bill does is it allows, so the president would declare an energy emergency, the FTC would do the investigation, and there would be, then the FTC could come in and say, you cannot charge above a certain level.
I don't see any price caps in are there defined price caps in the bill, Mr. Falone?
No, there's no caps or price controls in the bill, and I stress this is not price control. This is stepping in where the market economy is not working, because essentially these companies are like a monopoly, and they're not increasing production so they can keep the prices high. It's not socialism at all. It's stepping in where the market is not working and saying you can't do this manipulation. That's essentially what it is.
Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and I guess a couple statements and then a question or two. And I guess I'm not where either the chairman is or Mr. Cole is on this. Just looking at the numbers again, unemployment is down 40% since the first quarter of last year. Down 40%. Gained 8.5, almost 9 million jobs since the first quarter of last year. Exports are up 17.8% since the first quarter of last year. GDP is up 10.6% since the first quarter of last year. We came off of COVID, which had driven everything into the ground, including oil and gas. And now we've got a good economy that is bringing it back. Now we'll see where the interest rate hikes take us. That's a whole other question. But all of a sudden, we went from, in the dumps economically coming out of COVID to demand being high. That's what has driven these prices, in my estimation. So, Ms. McMorris Rogers, you say, well, prices have been going up since Joe Biden took office. Okay, so has employment, so have exports, so has the GDP. And usually high gas prices mean a good economy. I'm a bankruptcy lawyer. I handle a lot of oil and gas bankruptcies. And that was when the economy was in the dumps because nobody was doing anything. They didn't need any oil and gas. So now all of a sudden the economy's strong and getting, hopefully it remains strong. And that's driven up prices. Ukraine, another restriction on supply has driven prices higher. This is not rocket science we're dealing with here, in my opinion. Now, I disagree with your statements that the Biden administration has made it difficult on oil and gas. I have a family member who started a permitting procedure for some new oil and gas wells in New Mexico under Trump, was having a heck of a time, completed that permitting under Joe Biden, despite all the rhetoric that he's not allowing for permitting on federal properties. And luckily, they actually hit these wells, and they're looking to drill new wells. So there is activity in the oil patch. I know that personally. So I don't really, with all due respect to my chairman, I don't see, all right. I don't see, I see oil and gas, trying to do make up for lost time, in effect, maybe taking advantage of the situation, but I do see activity in the oil field. So I don't agree with Mr. Cole that, you made it so difficult that nobody can do anything. That's not true either. So what I'd like to know, Mr. Pallone, under this bill, how does this bill help bring down oil and gas prices? If you could tell me that.
Well, let me try to be brief. Look, I was listening to what Mr. Cole said, and I listened to what you said, and I really want you to understand that we're asking for more production. And I agree with you that there's nothing to stop increased production. In fact, when Mr. Cole talked about it takes a while to increase production, or maybe because the oil companies lost their shirts last time, they don't want to invest in production because they're afraid the price is going to go down, or they fear that, the future is all clean energy and therefore they don't want to make those investments. Those were the arguments that the oil companies made at our hearing. That's what they said, right? Now, I still think they're manipulating, and it's not just that they don't want to make the investments or they're afraid they're going to lose their shirt, because there's so much money to be made, that I don't buy it that that's an excuse, but it's at least a legitimate excuse. The idea that somehow we're not allowing, the government regulation is the problem, there's not enough permits. I mean, you're absolutely right, Mr. Promoter. That is not the problem. And they didn't suggest that was a significant problem. They talked about the things that Mr. Cole said, that we're afraid we're going to lose our shirt, the price is going to go down, all those kinds of things. But there's nothing, what this bill seeks to do is to try to get them to increase production, right? In other words, we say, if you're going to manipulate the market, or you're going to keep production down in order to keep the price up, then that's wrong. But we're encouraging more production. There's no question that that's what we want to do. We're asking for more production. We're saying that, let the market have a capitalist market. If you're going to make more money, you should invest more. You should produce more. You've got 9,000 leases right now that you could start on. You have oil wells right now that you're not pumping as much as you could. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but,
Do we provide any kind of an incentive, or are we just saying, do it?
No, there's nothing in here that specifically gives like a tax credit or any kind of incentive of that nature. But I think the idea is we're sending a message through this that we know that you're artificially keeping prices low and production low, and we're going to go after you if you do that. And so therefore you should increase production. You should look into, let the market forces don't monopolize this and keep production low. Production now is significantly less than it was before COVID. Right, the production before COVID was significantly higher than it is now. So it's not, market forces would dictate, in my opinion, that you would seek to produce more. But some of them are saying, well, why should we do that? Because maybe the price is going to go down. But I think there's significant indication here that there's manipulation because they want to keep the prices high.
Okay.
Dr. Burgess.
So that's accurate, what you just said? You want to increase production?
Absolutely. I said it at the hearing.
Well, wait a minute. We had no hearing on this bill.
No, we had a hearing with the
We
oil
had a
company. You
hearing
were, I don't know, maybe you weren't
generally.
on the subcommittee.
Yes, I was there.
All right.
I recall the questionable positions that you took that day. But look, we didn't have a hearing on this bill.
That is
We didn't have a
correct.
markup on this bill, and I think
I'm
some
not
of
arguing
the
that.
anxiety that we're dealing with right now could have been mitigated by having had the full committee process, subcommittee, full committee markup, bring it to
That
Rules
takes,
Committee.
you know how long that takes, and we have a crisis now. So that's my justification. I agree with you, it didn't go through regular order, but because of the emergency. That's the
Well,
reason.
the emergency also was slow in development. Most of us have seen this actually in evolution since January 21st of 2021, because that's clearly when the crisis began. We all felt it when we filled up our cars. You know, the other thing that came out in that hearing that you referenced, 2 years ago, the losses of these companies were absolutely staggering. And in fact, we're probably very fortunate that we did not lose more companies, leading to greater consolidation and a greater propensity for price manipulation. We're fortunate that a number of these companies did survive that downturn. And I know, probably heard it from an Oklahoman, but the cure for low oil prices is low oil prices, right? The market does tend to adjust. Now, it's all ground we've covered before, but the shame of it is that this is the hearing we're having on this. We should have had the opportunity to talk about this in our committee, because our committee does good work. Ranking Member Morris Rogers is right. We do great work in our committee. Our committee is, remember 40 years ago, people thought that if we prohibit the exportation of crude oil from this country, we'll keep the cost down for the consumer. And we actually had just exactly the opposite effect, and it was removing that restriction on exportation of crude oil that really lifted our economy back in 2016 and 2017 and provided the energy independence which we enjoyed for a brief period of time that really provided us significant opportunities in our foreign policy, for example. I mean, I remember the debates between then Senator McCain and then Senator Obama talking about sending all that money to the Middle East, to people that dislike us, and how great it would be if we were energy independent. And then 8 years later, we achieved that energy independence, and it was significant. And it was very frustrating to watch that bargained away for reasons that I don't understand, that predated the Ukraine war by easily a year's time. Now look, many of these products are sold on a global market. So if we do your price control bill that you're asking us to do, how does that affect, on the larger scale, how does that affect the global market? It's probably going to be, that's going to be indifferent to whatever we do on the local scale or on the national scale.
Well, I don't think it's indifferent, but I mean, it was what I didn't mention, and I think this kind of goes along with what you're saying, is that we see the same thing internationally. The Wall Street Journal had an article the other day about how the largest oil conglomerate or whatever in Saudi Arabia was making even bigger profits because obviously they were manipulating the production as well and keeping the production down. So what's happening here in the U.S. with the companies that testified before our hearing is also happening in Saudi Arabia and there's others. I mean, it's like a cartel or a monopoly. They're trying to keep production down to keep the price up. But the hope would be that at least, here in the United States, we should, hold the companies responsible for what they're doing. But I agree that you can't control what happens in Saudi Arabia. And they're doing the same thing.
But you can if you are producing, as Mr. Cole pointed out, we upped our production almost double in the,
Yeah,
in
but
those
it's
8 years.
right, but it has not increased in the last 2 or 3 years. It's less.
Because of the demand destruction that occurred in 2020 with the coronavirus. And yes, these things do take, these are big operations with let me just ask you this, what have we done to increase the availability of capital, to decrease the cost of capital for these companies that are doing the exploration? That actually came up in our hearing that you referenced. Have we done anything to reduce the cost of capital for these countries in exploration and production?
I mean, I can't answer
The
that.
answer is no, of course. We haven't. We've made it harder. If anything, with all of the crazy ESG stuff that we do, it makes it more difficult for companies to access capital. Mr. Cole referenced the evidence of price gouging. We've had hearings in our committee. You may remember some of them after Hurricane Katrina. Greg Abbott, now my governor, who was our attorney general in Texas after Hurricane Katrina, actually went after a couple of people locally in Texas, but it was it wasn't widespread. There were a couple of bad actors. They were held accountable, and the problem basically was non-existent. Do you remember those hearings?
I don't offhand, no, but I believe you.
Well, and that's exactly the point. I mean, there are existing laws that prevent price gouging, right?
No, there are existing laws, but what I'm saying is that this bill is different because it's saying because we have an energy emergency because of the price going up so much, that we would declare an emergency and then we would compare prices and say that this is excessive and this is market manipulation. I don't think the FTC has the ability to do that right now.
Well, Mr. Ranking Member, of course, Rogers, let me ask you a question. He said, you heard the chairman say that an emergency could be declared. Do we know what the parameters of this emergency are?
No.
What defines its beginning, what defines its end?
It's extremely vague.
So how does that get us to a better place, Mr. Pallone?
It gets us to a better place because the president can say that because prices have been going up
Let me
so
interrupt you.
much.
That's it. Price caps, right? The president can say,
It's not
this
a
is too
price-
high, I'm putting a cap on it.
It's not a price
That is
cap.
exactly what you're doing, and don't try to deny it.
It's not the same as-
That's exactly as was pointed out to you by the ranking member. Yes,
No, I disagree with Mrs. Rogers. I don't think it's in any, she used the example with the negotiating prices for drugs. I think it's very similar in the sense that we're not putting a cap on the price. In one case, we're negotiating a price. In this case, we're saying that if it's
Okay, that's
excessive, then we're
don't
going to
get me
call
started.
you.
That's a separate argument.
Okay.
Ranking member, of course, Rogers, you wanted to say.
It's not a price per se.
Thank you. The chairman asked where in the bill. I'd point to, let's see here, we're on page 3 under subsection B, number 2, where it says another appropriate benchmark period as determined by the commission. Part of the challenge is that this is an extremely vague authority that is given to the FTC. The FTC currently they can investigate price gouging. What is different about this legislation is that this is under an emergency declared by the president, where then the FTC can come in and determine if there's these unfair and deceptive practices that aren't defined in the bill either. But if you look at state law that has defined those kind of practices, that's where that language is used by states in some cases where they'll, I could go state by state, but some, it allows then for the commission to determine what the price would be. So that's where the price caps come in. And because this bill is so broad and vague, it's broad authority given to the FTC through the president's emergency declaration, and we're still living in a public health emergency declaration that has been used beyond what I think many of us ever imagined would be allowed during a public health emergency. This is an energy emergency that is very broad and vague, and it would allow, in this case, the FTC to come in and determine what the price of gas should be.
So we're allowing the executive allowing the president to declare the emergency, the parameters of which are undefined, the beginning and end are amorphous, and this will be done under rulemaking at the Federal Trade Commission. Just leads you to wonder what do the people even need a Congress for? Why where are we in this equation? And the answer is missing in action. Look, there's plenty of things we could do to ameliorate this price crisis. Lots of things that have been talked about. Ranking member has talked about them. Mr. Cole has talked about them. But for whatever reason, this administration refuses to go down that road. It is wrong that this crisis is absolutely avoidable, could have been avoided, should have been avoided, and for whatever reason, now we're doubling down on the very types of things that brought us to this point and will indeed make it worse. So thanks for the time. I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I just want to get back to the bill. The bill would allow the president to issue an emergency proclamation. So Republicans want to control everything, including a woman's right to choose over their own body. But they don't want the President of the United States to oversee the cost at the gas pump for average Americans. Okay? Would give the FTC an authority to issue civil penalties. And the civil penalties collected by the FTC under this bill would be put into a consumer relief fund. So Republicans are also against providing a relief fund to consumers who are being hurt by this price gouging. You know, it is convenient for them to forget short history when it's good for their talking point. So we are still in a pandemic. And at the onset of this COVID pandemic, the demand for gasoline, for oil, was down because nobody was driving. The economy was shut down. Now that the demand for oil has bounced back, the oil companies have not increased their production. They've chosen not to. Now, add a war, the Russian against Ukraine war, on top of that. We have seen a 17% increase in gas prices since the beginning of the attack on Ukraine. So it's laughable at best. It is incredibly deceiving to Americans to sit here and lecture on environmental issues, on what's right and right and what's wrong is wrong, when they themselves can't even speak to the issue of the bill, that the bill is trying to solve. And if we want to go back and revisit the Keystone Pipeline, a pipeline that Republicans refused to include a payment into, they would not have to pay into the insurance fund should a leak happen. This Canadian company would be exempt from paying into a relief fund, a disaster relief fund. The Keystone Pipeline, I mean, it simply violated so many issues, from sacred places, tribal homelands. We would sacrifice our water supply we would sacrifice by not honoring and disrespecting treaties. But they're okay with that. Republicans are okay with that, sacrificing the treaties we have made with Native people. And we would sacrifice their sacred places. Because they don't think that ExxonMobil, that made $5.5 billion in profits after taxes, and Chevron made $6.3 billion in the first 3 months. That's just in the first 3 months of 2022, is enough. That's what it's all about. How much is enough? Now, I think that every business, that opens their doors and hires people should have an opportunity to make money. It's the American way. But I don't think that they should have an opportunity to exploit a circumstance. So with that, I am going to call on Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. I just want to get one thing straight. The gas companies don't set the price. It's the free market that sets the price. And that is me saying that, but it's also Jason Furman, who was President Obama's economic advisor. And I can read you a direct quote. I quote, "When more people want to buy things than companies are capable of making, prices go up. That's just the law of supply and demand. Companies always want to maximize their profits. I don't think they're doing it any more this year than any other year," end quote. So it really comes down to a supply issue, and I think that our policies, more accurately the radical anti-oil and gas, anti-hydrocarbon policies of the left, has artificially reduced the supply. We've done it because capital is not moving in to oil and gas infrastructure projects. There's a lot of hesitancy. Also, regulation is up, which is making it hard to expand on land that is permitted. But Ranking Member McMorris-Rogers, as we heard Ranking Member Cole talk about the production decreasing, oil production is down. It's declined over 1.5 million barrels per day since Joe Biden took office. What do you attribute to that decline in production?
I believe from day one, the Biden administration has sent a pretty clear message that they are opposed to this industry. And it began with a Keystone, and I hear what others are saying about Keystone, but overall, pipelines right now, Line 5 in Michigan is under, there's concern about whether that pipeline is going to be able to continue. And pipelines are the safest, most environmentally friendly way to move product around. One of the biggest challenges right now to increasing production is pipeline capacity. And yet over and over, the administration has been quite a damper on pipelines. If we want to export LNG from the United States of America, and we have an abundant amount of LNG, help our allies in Europe, in Eastern Europe, it would be a great way to help our allies that are now purchasing 40% of their natural gas from Russia, because the Biden administration said it was okay for Nord Stream 2. It's okay for Russia to use a pipeline to bring natural gas into Europe and not pipelines in the United States. Anyway, there's been a signal sent by this administration, a damper on new pipelines, a damper on leases, a damper on drilling, delays on getting these permits. We hear a lot about the 9,000 leases. These are leases to explore or not explore. That's one step of it, and then you have to actually get a permit to drill. There's a lot involved in bringing product from the exploration stage to actually to the pump. And this administration from day one has been saying that they want to shut it down. And then calling Venezuela, calling OPEC and asking them to produce more. It has resulted in gas prices going up, energy prices going up, and us moving away from being American energy independent, which was so important.
Yeah, it's quite amazing that all through the election cycle, we heard how we need to reduce the amount of energy production, specifically petroleum production in the United States. Yet as soon as we're in a crisis, it's somehow Saudi Arabia's fault for not producing enough oil. I mean, it's quite the mental gymnastics you have to get through is quite amazing. But let's just talk about the pipeline. We're hearing that the Keystone XL pipeline, had it been completed, would not have made a difference. I believe that's truly absolutely inaccurate. Would you like to expand upon what you were saying?
Yes, so the Keystone XL pipeline would have been 800,000 barrels of oil from an ally, maybe our best friend, Canada. I believe we should be building that alliance instead of having to go to dictators in Venezuela or Iran or OPEC countries and asking them to produce more. And it would have been the most environmentally friendly pipeline. It was going to be the first green pipeline ever. It was cutting edge. Again, it was leading in technology and innovation to continue to accomplish the goal of bringing down carbon emissions. It is a false choice right now that is being presented. What the chairman was laying out, that it has to be either or. I believe that we can be energy independent. That should be our goal, to be energy independent and continue to lead the world in bringing down carbon emissions, which we have been doing. And our oil and natural gas is cleaner than anything coming out of Russia, but it's disappointing and frustrating to me how often that is just simply ignored, what our technology and innovation is meaning for accomplishing both goals, energy independence and bringing down carbon emissions, leading the world.
Thanks. You also were mentioning when we were talking about pipelines, just the fact that we would be in a much better position in terms of international power. For example, it's just not the Keystone XL pipeline that's been shut down, and that the language from the administration and the left has caused a freeze in investment, like I said, in oil and gas infrastructure. So, for example, I believe it was Mariner East 2 that was shut down. It wasn't shut down because the government came in and did it. It's because the investors didn't want to come in because they didn't think they'd get a return on the investment. And what that could have, I believe this is the correct pipeline, but it would be from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. So imagine a world where that pipeline went through and you were taking liquefied natural gas from Western Pennsylvania, shipping it through a very safe pipeline, environmentally friendly pipeline, and then to the port in Philadelphia, getting that to Gdansk, Poland, and then supplying Ukraine and our allies in Europe with energy instead of Russia. There's another pipeline I could talk about, I believe the Constitutional Pipeline that would run from Pittsburgh to Boston. New York will not let it go through, but instead of New Englanders having to rely on dirty Russian gas, which, by the way, burns tons of carbon emissions, just bringing it over here and fuels Putin. Or that's what we have in the alternative of just using LNG from Western Pennsylvania that is much cleaner. But talking about Ukraine, I hear that all of this is the fault of Vladimir Putin. I find that very hard to believe, especially if you look at the price increases before the war in Ukraine ever started. Would you like to expand upon that?
Yes. Well, I mentioned that when President Biden took office, the average gallon of gas in the United States of America cost $2.38. And it went up $1 in the first year, and it has continued to increase. You mentioned the pipeline to Massachusetts. Since President Biden took office, we had increased our Russian imports of crude oil by 17% in the first year, importing into Massachusetts, importing into a state like Washington State. So we were seeing our production going down in the United States, the damper on American energy, at the same time that we were increasing our imports from Russia. Now, thankfully, this Congress did take action and made clear that we should not be importing from Russia. There is more that we could have been doing for years. The Energy and Commerce Committee, we traveled to the Ukraine, well, we traveled to Europe and Ukraine in 2015. That was the spring after Putin had shut down the pipelines into Ukraine, using natural gas as a weapon then. It was a threat. You either do what I want you to do, or I'll shut down the pipeline. And they were asking us then to provide more supply so they wouldn't be so dependent upon President Putin, Europe and Ukraine. And yet there has been this resistance to more clean natural gas in the United States during the Shell Revolution that has just exploded here, providing an abundant amount of natural gas that has helped us bring down our carbon emissions, and it's the way that the rest of the world, it would help our allies if we were supplying natural gas to Europe, and it would help bring down carbon emissions worldwide. It's one of the best things that we could do.
I think if the war has done anything, it's really shown that energy production is the equivalent of national security. And it certainly is directly proportional to the amount of influence we have abroad. But talking about issues abroad again, I've heard a lot of talk about other oil-producing nations, and if they were to increase the flow of crude oil to the United States, it's my understanding that even if that were to happen, it would take 8 months, maybe a year for that to even hit the market, because our refinery capability is far below what it should be. Would you like to talk about the fact that the policies from the left have led to a lack of investment in our refinery capability?
Yes, I want to see America lead, and it means having more refining capability, more pipeline capability. But yet the regulatory climate has made it very difficult to upgrade plants, impossible to build new refining plants in the United States of America. This is where the United States, we lead in environmental regulations. We have the highest environmental standards, clean air, clean water standards, and yet some are willing to import from other countries, turn a blind eye to what's going on with the environment, and instead of actually producing here in the United States.
Yeah, I think if we could just, there's two rules that we could live by with this argument. That is, again, the supply and demand argument that Dr. Furman put much better than I could ever put in the quote I opened with, but also the fact that capital goes where capital is treated best. And right now, capital does not believe it will be treated well in the hydrocarbon sector, and that's one of the reasons why, again, we have artificially deflated our production. But, Madam Chair, thank you for the time, and I yield back.
Thank you. I just want to correct something that was stated. 17% of the oil that you said that we purchased is from Russia.
No, I said a 17% increase. I'm sorry if I misspoke.
Okay.
I meant to say 17%.
I want to say that
Okay.
last year, total import from Russia into the U.S. was 7.9%. 7.9%. Between 2007 and 2010, tar sand oil, which is what the Keystone Pipe would bring to the U.S., spilled at a rate of 3 times more than pipelines carrying conventional crude. The XL pipe would have crossed agriculturally important, environmentally sensitive areas, including hundreds of rivers, streams, aquifers, and water bodies. That's what was at stake. That's why the president felt that it was more important to protect water, to protect our quality of life, these sensitive areas, and stand up for the treaties that have been signed with tribes. And with that, I would recognize my colleague, Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, when politicians talk about economics, it always cracks me up because, and we've seen a good example of it today. You know, here we have a situation where under the Biden administration, 8.5 or 9 million jobs have been added to the economy. We've had a dramatic reduction in unemployment. We've got the greatest employment figures we've seen in more than 50 years. And our colleagues say, and maybe they're right about it, well, that's just the natural workings of the market. That's supply and demand, and you can't attribute that to any of the policies that the Biden administration has been engaged in to try to promote full employment in the country. And the GDP has gone up, trade has gone up, but they say it's got nothing to do with the Biden administration, that's just the working of the free market. But then, when it comes to inflation, we have a situation where with COVID-19, we saw the demand for oil and gas plummet because nobody was going anywhere, right? The whole economy was shutting down, so the demand went way down, and the production of oil and gas went way down with it. So then we start to come out of COVID, we start lifting the various restrictions and mandates. People are using vaccine. Demand now starts soaring, but production hasn't caught up. And we blame it on Joe Biden. That's got to be Joe Biden. It's Biden's fault. It's the Biden administration's fault. But wait a second. I thought we were saying before that when things happen in the economy, those are just the natural laws of supply and demand, and you can develop explanations based on historical events. So this is why it kind of cracks me up to hear politicians talk about economics, because they will demonize and vilify their opponents for anything bad that happens during their administration, but they won't attribute anything good to them that is taking place at the exact same time. I mean, we're talking about the inflation unemployment curve, and they will blame any aspect of inflation on him, but they won't credit him with any of the great employment figures we've got. But leave that to the side. Economics is not my specialty, although I am a bit of a student of political rhetoric. And I've taken economics, and I happen to be a huge fan of Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations. And so I want to go to the question of calling this legislation socialist. I thought that was rather interesting because as I read the legislation, it is just a bit of an improvisation in the middle of a crisis on existing laws dealing with unfair trade practices. And it would allow the president to declare that there's an emergency, which I think there is an emergency. It's an emergency for people how expensive gas is. I understand that there are people celebrating it. There are people in the oil and gas industry. The gentleman from Oklahoma is right. There are people who benefit from it and profit from it, and not just people at the top. There are people, in the oil and gas industry at other levels who are celebrating what's taking place. But most of the country's hurting. Most people are not celebrating. Most people are not cheering this. And, we read articles about how well the companies are doing. Billions of dollars more in this quarter than a year ago that they were making. Their profits are up 25%, 50% over where they were before. I understand why they are uncorking the champagne bottles in oil and gas, but this legislation would say it's an emergency in a lot of parts of the country for a lot of people. Let's take it seriously. Let's not just, blame our political opponents and then celebrate the fact that some people are getting rich off of this. So it says the president has the right to declare an emergency, and then when charges are unconsciously excessive or exploitative, then the general apparatus we have in place against unfair trade practices kicks in. Now, first of all, Mr. Pallone, do I basically have it right that this is already what the law is under the Federal Trade Commission Act, that you can't engage in unfair trade practices, and this just gives the president the power to declare an emergency to activate those provisions to determine whether there are companies that are engaged in unconsciously excessive price gouging?
Well, I would say it goes a little beyond what you're saying. I mean, you're basically right, but I think that the point I'm trying to make is that to just leave it to the FTC to decide whether there's price gouging right now might not be good enough. In other words, under this bill, because of the emergency, they would be able to go further and say, this is excessive, this is exploitative, and tries to explain what those aggravating situations might be. So I think it defines it a little better, and it makes it a lot easier for them to do it. Maybe is the best way to describe it.
All right. But as I understand the terms of legislation, what it says is if there are general prices that are prevailing, but you can demonstrate that certain companies have jacked up the price way beyond that in a way that's grossly excessive, that's a gross departure from the norm, then the general unfair trade practice provisions could kick in.
No, I agree, but I think that what we're trying to do is to define this a little better, to give them more power and penalties and also the language from Senator Cantwell about manipulation. That we mentioned.
So Ms. Morris-Rogers, are you opposed to the general FTC provisions about unfair trade practices?
I don't think so.
Okay, so what would be wrong with saying if a particular company engages in unconsciously, unconscionably excessive gouging increases, that the FTC could then use those provisions in this situation?
To impose price controls?
No, it's not price
What you're
controls.
asking?
You mean like Richard Nixon's price controls, the last president who imposed them? No, there's no price controls as I read it in the legislation. All it does is it activates FTC's power to act against unfair trade practices.
Part of this goes to the importance of us having a markup in committee, having a hearing in committee so that we could actually understand what these definitions are. The bill as written is very vague.
All right, what language is confusing to you about price controls? Because I couldn't find language of price controls in there anywhere.
The definition of unfair and deceptive practices is not defined.
Well, that comes from the FTC Act, which I thought you did support too. That's in current law about unfair trade practices. So all this is saying is that if there are unconscionably excessive prices being imposed on gas and oil.
Excessive is not defined.
Right, but excessive is a common term within this whole field of FTC policy. So you define it with respect to the market, if you will. So,
and it talks about the periods of time to activate, what that might be. Like you're looking at prices before and after in a particular locale.
Yeah.
That type of thing.
Given the last 2 years under a public health emergency, that we don't know when's going to come to an end, I do not feel comfortable. I have grave concerns about giving power to the president to declare an emergency with such broad, vague terms. Who knows what is going to be put under this energy emergency?
Fair enough. So you say President Biden might want to go further and really lower gas and oil prices below what the companies ought to be able to charge. And so Biden is fighting too hard for the consumers to lower gas and oil prices, but none of it can be done without the FTC acting and then going to court and proving it. So the bottom line is, look, I don't think this is a be-all and end-all. I don't think this is going to save us from the situation we're in, but I think it can help us. And the language of socialism, I just don't see how it applies here. I mean, the American progressive tradition is all about making sure that people don't get ripped off. Nothing in this bill is about the government taking over the gas and oil fields or taking over the gas and oil companies. That's what I think socialism is, when you have state control of the means of production. And all this is saying is what 42 states have said, which is don't gouge the consumers. Don't take advantage of your position. And is that an anti-capitalist position? I don't think so. And for that, I will quote my beloved Adam Smith from The Wealth of Nations itself in 1776. And here's what he said: people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. Adam Smith loved the idea of competition, but he said the people in competition are always going to be tempted to jack up the prices against the consumers. That's Adam Smith himself. Yeah. I mean, it's throughout The Wealth of Nations. And read, the theory of moral sentiments. So he didn't idolize and romanticize capitalism. He said it works when you have a real market in place and a government that enforces rules. Otherwise, people are going to get ripped off. And I think that's all The
Right.
gentleman is saying, and I think that's all that HR 7688 is saying, the American people understand that the oil companies are producing gas and making gas. They also understand the oil companies have ripped people off in the past, and they can rip people off in a crisis, and this just gives the government the power to check that. So I like this bill.
Can I just,
Yes.
I totally agree with you, and I don't want to prolong this, but, you know, a lot of those on the Republican side in the last hour or so have been talking again and again about, you know, the Keystone Pipeline and lack of permits and making it more difficult for oil companies to produce. And I just want to say, and I said it in the beginning, this is not the case. It is not the case. We have been advocating for increased production. The president is trying to increase production. And the bottom line is that I believe, and I think most of us believe, that there has to be a mix. We're not saying that, you know, everything is going to be renewables now, because we know that you still have to have fossil fuels. And we had a hearing on hydropower. We've had hearings on nuclear. We've had hearings on all different types of energy. The bottom line is, in my opinion, the only legitimate argument that's being made on the other side, in my opinion, is what Mr. Cole said, and it's the same thing that the oil companies said at the hearing. They said, we are not making these investments because we're afraid the price is going to go down and we're going to lose our shirt. We're not making these investments for all these different reasons. But the bottom line is they are not increasing production. They are not doing it. And it may be because they're afraid that the price is going to go down. I think that if you pass this bill, you'll have a much clearer picture of what the real reason is why they're not increasing production and having more supply, which is they want to keep the price high. But that's what they said at the hearing. They didn't say that they didn't talk about Keystone. They didn't talk about lack of permits. They didn't talk about not having enough permits to do LNG. No one said that. They talked about the industry, and the industry being afraid to increase production because of all these, you know, historical reasons why maybe they would lose their shirt. And maybe that's a legitimate reason, but I don't believe that that's what's happening. I believe that they're keeping production low and supply limited so they can make more money and huge profits. And again, I don't want to take up your time, but we've heard a lot about it.
No, I appreciate that. It's a strategic business decision, and I think, as the gentleman from Pennsylvania said, I mean, businesses are out to make money. They're out to make profit, and that's what they do in our system. That's right. But then there comes a point where certain businesses are acting in a way totally against the public interest, as Adam Smith said, and that's why we have antitrust laws, which you could say interfere with the free market. And just by the way, because I think you guys are the committee that deals with this too, because there's been so much rhetoric about the free market today, and I love the idea of a free market, but a free market has got to be a fair market organized by law. Aren't you guys debating the question of whether or not the government in the Medicare program should have the power to negotiate in a free market with the prescription drug companies for lower prices, or whether that price should be set by the companies?
Again, it's the same thing. It's Adam Smith, right? When you say Adam Smith, I keep thinking of our Adam Smith. But
the original Adam Smith.
The original Adam Smith. Yeah, in other words, when the market forces are not working, that's when the government has to step in because it's become a monopoly. That's the whole progressive tradition of Teddy Roosevelt and Taft and
I mean, it sounds to me like socialism or corporate socialism to have Big Pharma dictating the prices for their own products, which is why our consumers are paying 5 or 10 times for the same pharmaceuticals that people are paying in Canada and in Europe, in other countries. You look for socialism, look there. But here, all we're talking about is preventing the worst exploitation of this crisis that was caused by events that are obvious to everybody coming out of COVID-19. I yield back to you, Madam Chair.
Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first of all, I'd just like to associate myself with the comments of Ranking Member Cole, Dr. Burgess, and Mr. Reschenthaler. And I also just kind of want to bring things back, you know, the conversation back. There are things that the majority and the president could be doing that would help keep those gas prices low and also help lower our dependence on foreign oil. But has been mentioned, I guess, a couple of times, the administration is choosing not to go in that direction. So I guess we have this bill in front of us. And Mr. Cole had asked about finding the companies that are price gouging. And as I recall from the conversation and from the response, that there seemed to be that there weren't any.
that anyone could talk about right now or name right now. But I feel like, a little like if this bill does become law, then it will make it so much easier for the majority and the administration to find those companies that are price gouging because, and as some of the conversation was, that that the majority has chosen not to define unconscionably excessive, and they have made the definition of what emergency, energy emergency, I guess it is, very vague, so that they will be able to proceed doing all these things with very loose rules around it. And so I find it very distressing that they have chosen not to define those things very tightly. And I think any of the attorneys would agree that things should be defined so that we understand them better, and particularly in legislation, things that we are putting into federal law, we have a responsibility to define those well so that everybody understands what is going on. But I did just want to make sure, number one, I wanted to ask the ranking member, are those things reasonable that without those definitions being very tight, we're going to kind of open up the floodgates?
I have grave concerns about how vague the definitions are in this bill. The FTC can already investigate oil and gas industry. They have a significant authority. They have been doing that for over 100 years, and they've never found systemic price gouging. As I mentioned, we asked Secretary Granholm, Energy Secretary, in front of the hearing with the oil executives if she believed, well, I guess it was right after that, she came in separately. We asked her if she believed that there was price gouging, and she said, I don't think anyone is talking about price gouging today. But as the bill is currently written, it would amount to price controls by the FTC because it's giving them the authority to enforce against whatever they deem as unconscionably excessive. As you were pointing to, that pricing, that could be any price that they decide. That is where the price controls come in. That's where the government is coming in and given the authority to impose price controls. And as others have mentioned, and price controls were attempted in the 70s, and supply actually decreased, and prices went up further, and it led to even further inflation going into the 80s. We know that that is not the approach that works. What we need to do is increase supply. And this is actually the first time that I've heard so much conversation about the importance of increasing supply, but I'm encouraged that the chairman and others are recognizing that we do need to increase supply in the United States, because our president from day one has been sending a pretty clear message that the goal is to decrease oil and natural gas in the United States.
Thank you, Ranking Member. And then I just do want to just ask you, Ranking Member, if there's anything else that you would want to add or summarize before I yield back.
Well, I would just build upon that President Biden campaigned on shutting down American oil and gas. And I've gone through some of that. He continues to cancel new lease sales and refuses to issue permits for drilling while blaming the industry for not doing enough to produce. Just 2 weeks ago, canceled massive new sales in Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico that would have led to much needed increase in domestic production. This administration has also failed to issue a 5-year oil and natural gas leasing plan for the Outer Continental Shelf, something that both Republican and Democrat administrations in the past have done. And according to a recent analysis, a further delay of federal offshore leasing could result in 500,000 fewer barrels of domestic oil produced per day, 60,000 lost jobs, and a $900 million annual decrease in federal conservation funding. We can turn course, and we should do so. This legislation is not going to do anything to actually bring down the cost of gas.
Thank you, Ranking Member, and I just want to kind of sum it up, and I think it's fair to say that this legislation is not going to do anything to increase supply, lower prices, or lessen our dependence on foreign oil. So thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, Chairman. We've heard from multiple economists from our witnesses that there's a number of reasons why gas prices have gone up. Certainly, all of us have heard from our constituents the concern about the fact that supply has driven prices up and that Putin's invasion of Ukraine has driven prices up. So we're looking for solutions here. And I appreciate Chairman Pallone coming here with one of the solutions. Now, we're talking about solutions to the immediate problem here. Is that right, Chairman Pallone? I mean, we've seen the administration do a couple releases of oil and gas from the strategic reserve. We've seen some other measures, and this is just adding to the toolkit of how we can address the immediate crisis. Is that right?
That's correct. And, you know, I haven't mentioned, you know, long-term efforts to move towards renewables, which obviously I support because I think, if anything, you know, the volatility of a fossil fuel market is a justification for trying to encourage renewables. But I would stress that we're for a mix, right? We know we have to continue with oil and natural gas, and we talk about nuclear and hydro and everything.
Thank you. Yes, we've heard several references to the fact that there was obviously price spikes in the 70s. And I'm reminded of the old saw that, you know, the definition of insanity is to keep doing the same thing. I completely agree with you that we need to diversify our energy sources and look at renewables so that we don't keep ending up in this situation. So thank you for your continued long-term solutions, as well as bringing us some solutions to the current problem. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be relatively brief. I appreciate the comments. I appreciate the conversation, the dialogue, and the back and forth. I think none of us want to be here in considering this bill. I don't think the chairman does. I don't think any of us do. But you know, we face a series of crises that are hard to ignore. And in the midst of these crises, we have some choices to make. It is important to remember, and I think others have said this more eloquently than I can, but we don't live in a pure economic system. I'm not sure there is such a thing anywhere on the planet. We're a capitalist society, but we live in a place, in an economy that's regulated. We have labor laws, we have late wage laws, we have antitrust laws, we have a whole series of law that's been put in place over the 2 centuries plus that attempts to and seeks to regulate the worst impulses that can be in a pure market-driven system, and so that we don't have simply winners and losers. So that's important to remember. And you know, and others again have said this, but we face a world where we have threats from the crisis in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. We are dealing with the fallout from COVID, which had volatile swings in supply and demand over the last 2 years in all industries around the world in a global economy. And we balance these issues while having an existential crisis involving climate. So, you know, trying to balance all this is by no means an easy task, and yet we face for consumers and businesses huge price spikes that, frankly, at a time, and I understand it. I mean, you know, shareholders and oil companies have had challenges getting what they want to be in terms of rate of return over the last several years. This is an opportunity, and frankly, there's questions about whether demand couldn't be or supply couldn't be increased to meet demand, and there's lack of desire on the part of some in the oil and gas industry to limit that supply so that they can drive shareholder value. So I think, given all of those factors and given the real challenges this places on our economy and on the families, American families, consumers, this seems to me to be a pretty modest approach and a reasonable approach to make sure that people don't profiteer off of the difficult circumstances that we face. And again, I don't think we want to be here, but these are times to try men's and women's souls. Our job is to make sure that we make adjustments to an economy that is facing real challenges. So I appreciate Mr. Chairman Pallone being here. I appreciate the sponsors of the bill. I'll vote for the rule and the underlying legislation. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Desaulniers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want a brief comment, say I'll support the bill. And to Mr. Cole's comments, as someone who represents an area in California that has 5 oil refineries in it and is headquartered by Chevron, the second largest American company, and having been a former regulator appointed by 2 Republican governors and a Democrat, I support this bill because I think it's a prudent thing to do. It's clear to me that the industry sees multiple declining assets as the money, in all deference to my colleague from Pennsylvania, is moving to renewables and alternatives. So they want to make as much money as possible. And I think, Mr. Chairman, your comments, their public comments about their profitability right now, leads to an obvious conclusion, for my part, representing an area that's got thousands of oil company employees and contractors. And I know them, they're friends, they're constituents, they were customers of mine. I've been to a few of their funerals who have died because of incidents, because of corporate culture in these refineries. So out of respect, I just believe that this is the right, prudent thing to do. Support it, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to just associate myself with the comments of my colleagues, particularly Mr. Morelli, who I think laid things out exactly right. I think we're all in favor of companies making money. We are, this is the United States of America. This is not a socialist country. However, when we're in times of crisis, and right now we have an inflation problem, which is caused by coming out of a pandemic and by a war in Ukraine. We need to have everybody step up to the plate. And when they don't, when they take advantage of our constituents who are having a rough enough time, it's our job. It is our job to protect our constituents and hold our corporate partners to a higher standard. And I think this is a good bill, and I agree with the rule, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any other member of the committee wish to ask any questions of this panel? Seeing none.
Yeah,
You have a question?
If you would mind, just one follow-up for both of our witnesses. Just since emergency is really not defined all that well in the language, am I to assume that climate change could qualify as an energy emergency?
I believe it could.
Is it correct?
I think it's quite clear from the language in the bill, we're talking about gas prices.
No, we're talking about an energy emergency. It's otherwise not defined.
Right, but it's not an energy emergency related to the environment, it's related to pricing.
Well, I think your answer is yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, one time, anybody else have any questions of this panel? Seeing none, you are free to go. Thank you very, very much. We'll now go to the next, we'll now hear from any amendment witnesses on HR 7688 at the end of the hearing portion of today's meeting. We are now going to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on HR 7309, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2022. Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Fox, we are delighted that you are here, even though I don't see you. Are they coming in, or are they on? Okay. So talk amongst yourselves while we wait for it. This Chairman Scott, we're delighted that you're here, and I know Ranking Member Fox is on her way. So why don't we begin with what? Oh, she's in the hall. What? So, Mr. Scott, why don't we begin with you?
Hold on. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. So, did he call me?
Okay. You may proceed.
I'm sorry. Did you call on me, Mr. Chairman?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Yeah, we called on you, Mr. Chairman Scott.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Cole. I'm pleased to speak today in strong support of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2022, which I introduced with Higher Education and Workforce Investment Chairwoman Frederica Wilson. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act is the backbone of our workforce development system. Each year, the WIOA programs provide working people across the country with the skills they need to find better paying and more sustainable careers. It's not just workers who benefit from these proven workforce development programs. By equipping workers with competitive skills, WIOA also helps ensure that employers have access to dedicated and skilled workforce. Unfortunately, the authorization for WIOA expired 2 years ago, and our investment in workforce development program, our investment in workforce development has fallen dramatically over time. To put that in context, our labor force has grown by approximately 50% over the last 4 decades, but the federal spending in workforce development has fallen by 2/3 when adjusted for inflation. This underinvestment hurts not only our workers, but also the businesses and our economy. While other developed nations spend between 0.5% and 1% of their total gross domestic product on workforce development, we only spend 0.1%. In other words, we're allowing other economies around the world to outcompete us. Now, if we are to maintain our global competitive edge and accelerate our economic recovery from COVID-19, we must commit to seriously investing in workforce development. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2022 remedies this chronic underinvestment so that we can finally meet the needs of both workers and businesses. By investing $78 billion in WIOA programs over the next 6 years, the legislation will more than double the number of those receiving training services in fiscal year 2023 and allow us to train approximately 1 million workers per year by 2028. However, this proposal goes beyond just including adequate funding for WIOA, WIOA is needed for decades. The reauthorization of WIOA will do a number of things, like combat recidivism, funding and making permanent a Department of Labor program to help justice-involved individuals obtain and sustain employment. It expands summer and year-round subsidized employment for disconnected youth, in addition to reauthorizing the Youth Bill program. It makes critical reforms to Job Corps by ensuring that campuses are fully funded and that their operators are awarded contracts through a truly competitive process. It codifies and expands what we call sector-based training programs at the national and local level so that we can fund training programs for entire sectors, such as electric cars or trucking or nurses, entire sectors that will be seriously understaffed if we fail to act. And it strengthens community colleges' capacity to provide workers with the employment and training needed to succeed in in-demand industries. The evidence is clear. We've made critical progress towards recovering from the pandemic. However, we now have record low unemployment and record job growth, and we know that job openings currently exceed applicants and employers are clamoring for skilled workers. We should all agree that now is the time to reauthorize WIOA and expand access to high-quality job training opportunities. I want to thank Higher Education and Workforce Investment Chairwoman Frederica Wilson for her leadership in investing in workers, lowering costs, and strengthening our economic recovery. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2022 was a result of about a year-long, sometimes bipartisan effort, including 3 hearings led by Ms. Wilson. So I invite all of my colleagues to support this legislation to help workers and businesses in America. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ranking Member Fox, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman and members of the Rules Committee, H.R. 7309, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, is a missed opportunity. It is a missed opportunity for bipartisanship. It's a missed opportunity to modernize our workforce development programs. It's a missed opportunity to expand the role of employers in workforce development programs. And it's a missed opportunity to remove barriers to skills development. This legislation not only fails to modernize WIOA, but also moves this program backwards by undoing some of the most important bipartisan reforms passed in 2014. HR 7309 will force job creators and workers to face more bureaucratic hurdles, and taxpayers will be expected to fork over more of their hard-earned money. What our workforce needs now are programs that will close the skills gap and prepare the next generation of workers to meet the changing needs of our economy. That is not what this bill does. Democrats' WIOA reauthorization doubles down on the failing status quo. Given the current labor shortage, the workforce system needs to be streamlined to focus funds more effectively on upskilling job seekers rather than on wasteful government bureaucracy. But during the Education and Labor Committee's markup, Democrats opposed Republican solutions to do just that, including a proposal to allocate 70% of WIOA funds for adult and dislocated workers for skills development services. Upskilling workers should be WIOA's top priority, not wage controls and pro-union policies. Additionally, instead of cutting down on administrative and bureaucratic waste in our workforce system, HR 7309 adds to it. Excess bureaucracy can slow innovation. Democrats don't seem to care. Further, instead of embracing new workforce development models, Democrats are clinging to an outdated Depression-era apprenticeship model that does not meet the needs of modern workers. In fact, Democrats have all but locked job creators out of the process of informing workforce development programs and have instead embraced outdated and unhelpful programs that do not give young people the skills they need to succeed. The more we can take decision-making power out of the hands of bureaucrats and put it in the hands of job creators, industry leaders, and skill development providers, the sooner we can close the skills gap and set our economy on the right track. Employers deserve a seat at the table. They are the ones who can respond best to changing industry needs. And in the realm of workforce development, listening to the Americans who actually create jobs will produce the best outcomes. Lastly, this legislation fails to protect taxpayers at a time of rampant inflation. In FY 2021, WIOA's Title I provisions cost taxpayers $1.8 billion. What were the results? Fewer than 1/4 of enrollees exited programs with occupations related to the workforce development program in which they were enrolled. Let me repeat. Fewer than 25% of young enrollees and only 30% of adults came out of the programs into jobs related to the workforce development programs in which they were enrolled. These are dismal results. Throwing good money after bad is not the way to do these things. We need workforce development programs that actually work for the American people, and I yield back.
Thank you. And without objection, I'd like to insert into the record the statement of administration policy in support of this legislation. Without objection. And Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Fox, you both were succinct. I agree with Chairman Scott. You didn't persuade me, but I appreciate your testimony, so I don't have any questions. I'll yield to Mr. Cole.
Well, I was actually more persuaded by Dr. Fox, just to make that point. But I do have one question. Dr. Fox, my good friend, You were very heavily involved in 2014 when we had the last WIOA authorization. It was very bipartisan. We came up here really with a deal between the parties that moved through. I don't think that's likely to happen, given I think we had a straight party line vote in your committee on this legislation. I'd like to just take a few minutes and talk about some of the things that perhaps you put forward in committee or that you think would have made this more effective in doing something, again, we both want to do. We both want a more skilled workforce, and we both sides want people to have the opportunity to do well. And then you also mentioned some areas specifically where you thought progress had been lost. Not that we just disagreed, but literally we undid some of the good things that had happened in 2014. So if you'd just take a few minutes and point out some of the things we should have done, some of the things where perhaps we undid some bipartisan successes of previous years.
Well, let me also say, I didn't say it in my opening remarks, that before I came to Congress and before I was in the state Senate, but before that I was the president of community college. So WIOA didn't exist as WIOA at that time, but there was the Job Training Partnership Program. So I experienced many of these things firsthand as a community college president and was actually appalled at what I saw. And many of the things are what the Democrats, again, want to go back to. But let me say what some of the things were that we did in 2014, and you're right, it was a bipartisan bill when it passed the House the first time. We went to the Senate and stayed there for a while and then came back, and it was very bipartisan when it passed and became law, and President Obama signed it. So what I've already mentioned is the bill expands the size of workforce development boards. One of the things that we did was to shrink the size of the workforce development boards in order to give employers more input into what was going on. Before that time, it was the unions and the educational bureaucrats who decided what should be done with people coming in to help them have the skills they need. Employers were sort of an afterthought. So we think the employer should have a greater voice in designing the programs. They're the ones that are going to hire these people, for heaven's sakes, and they want people who have skills when they hire them. This bill also further inserts, and I heard some of the previous rules panel, and it's Washington bureaucrats making decisions as to how we're going to handle workforce development. Big Brother with a lot of value judgments about what are the kinds of jobs that we think are the good jobs, which jobs are not the good jobs. Most of us nowadays, I think, working, started out maybe not in the best job, not with a lot of benefits, but we knew we weren't going to stay in those jobs forever. And we also knew, I think most people do, even now, or a lot of people do, you get started and then you move up. But we have people, we fear that Washington will make judgments about which jobs are good, which jobs are not good, and then say, well, no, we're not going to set up programs to help people get the skills, even for those entry-level jobs, because they're not good enough. They don't have enough benefits. Well, we just don't think that's the right way to do it. We think, again, employers need to be more engaged with what's going on, and we don't need people in Washington making decisions on what should be entry-level jobs and what should be any job for a person. It really tears down the basic freedom that Americans have, and it's not good.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you. I don't think that's what this bill's about, but when you were saying that Washington knows best and bureaucrats are making very personal choices for people, I can't help but think about the debates we have in this Congress over whether a woman has a right to choose when it comes to abortion. And this Congress has voted on a regular basis to decide for a woman whether she has that right or not. And, I mean, when it comes to very personal decisions, including who one can marry, I've been here long enough when my Republican friends have decided Washington can decide who you can marry, what's appropriate. And so I don't see the bill as you do, but I just, you know, when I hear about Washington and bureaucrats making decisions for people, unfortunately, that's what the Republican Party's been all about. It's not about freedom, it's about controlling people's lives. And I think that a lot of people in this country have had enough of that, but I yield to Mr. Perlmutter.
No, I want to see this whole program maintained and expanded, especially, and you brought up, Ms. Fox, the community colleges, and I'm very fortunate in my district to have some outstanding community colleges that work well with particularly the technical schools in our school system, our K through 12 school system, you know, and I've been out to a number of them over the course of the last couple of months, but obviously over my 16 years. And the work they're doing to ready and prepare young people in my area for the jobs of this century and beyond, we've got to maintain this, expand it. Things are changing so fast, and I support this bill wholeheartedly and yield back to the chair.
Thank you. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll agree with that statement. I've got some great community colleges, and in fact, high school school district that has an advanced technology center available to students so that they can graduate from high school with a cosmetology certificate, court reporting certificate, and actually enter the workforce with no additional student debt. But since I brought up student debt, that seems to come up a lot. I just recently visited with a number of Texas technology companies, and they, of course, spoke to the fact that they need workers and that they don't have the applicants that they think that they need, and they want some type of federal program to deal with that. I feel their pain, but it seems like there's an opportunity there with this significant student debt load that some individuals are carrying. Look, in the federal agencies are allowed to set up loan repayment programs amongst their employees in order to attract and keep employees. I'm sure there are some private sector employers that are doing that as well, but is that something that you all talked about during the hearings leading up to this bill? Is there a way to allow the retirement of student debt to help bring people into the workforce?
Well, actually, in one of the CARES Acts, I don't remember which one, it actually happened twice. There was a provision in there for employers to pay $5,250 back per year per employee of student debt. We already have in the tax code the ability for employees to pay $5,250 per year of education expenses. So because of the problem of hiring people, I think it was in the CARES Act, one of the versions of the CARES Act, we did it twice, actually. We did it once for like 2.5 months, and then it was made permanent or made for 9 years or whatever we can do on that. So that is out there, and I've done my best to spread the word on that too. So anytime somebody comes to me and says, I can't hire people, I make sure they know about those two programs that exist out there. I've sent letters out to all my chambers of commerce, every single employer I talk to, but that's already out there. And to go to the comment Mr. Perlmutter made, community colleges in many places are doing a great job. In fact, that's what their title tells you what they're there to do, which is to meet the needs of the community. And as the president of a community college, that's what I did. I went out and met with the employers and said, what kind of programs do you need? I got rid of a program that was doing no good and added a program that the employers needed. That's why it's so important to keep these programs local. And they have funding already to do this. And by the way, your governor, Mr. Polis, Governor Polis, was one of the original people who voted for WIOA when it passed the House. And I think he's always had good ideas about workforce development. So I think I don't know all the details about Colorado, but I would say he's probably doing a great job. I know Texas is doing a great job all across the board. High schools, community colleges, universities, to get at the problems we're seeing in education and workforce development. I don't know every state. I just know certain ones that stand out, but Texas is doing a great job.
They always do. Let me just ask you this, on the issue of retirement student debt, at the committee level, have you done any sort of oversight as to, is this functioning as intended? Is it helping the situation? Could it be better? Could it be improved? What have you encountered?
These kinds of programs can always be improved. This was good legislation when it was passed in 2014, but we knew that it had shortcomings, and we hear from people all the time. And our goal as Republicans is to write a bill that would take into consideration what we're hearing from employers and others who are administering the program and make it better, improve what's out there, not go backwards to what existed before 2014, and also to give the union so much control over what happens in these programs.
So to that end, were the apprenticeship programs addressed as to how they could be improved going forward?
Well, we have separate legislation on apprenticeships that really focuses on those. That bill got passed again on a very partisan basis, unfortunately. We would like to improve what's happening in apprenticeship programs. A lot was done in the Trump administration on getting companies to increase the number of apprenticeships they were doing without their getting much by way of any kind of taxpayer support for them. So there's a lot of interest in giving some support to those companies that do that. But right now, that would be handled in an apprenticeship bill primarily.
Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Torres. Mr. Raskin.
No questions, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rushenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Also, no questions.
Ms. Scanlon. Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to just first of all thank Chairman Scott. I have the great privilege of serving on the Education and Labor Committee with a number of my colleagues, Mr. DeSaulnier, and I really appreciate the hard work that went into this. And I can't imagine a more important topic facing the workforce than how we provide an ability for people to get into jobs and industry. How do we continue to work on making certain we have a workforce adequate to rebuild the supply chain in the United States, and really to deal with the labor shortage in so many different industries. And this is really an important part of the strategy to get that all moving forward again, and to really connect people, particularly in communities that have been held back in previous economic expansions, particularly among communities of color, to get more women into STEM industries, and all of the work that we went into doing this will advance that. And I also appreciate staff entertaining and hopefully being supportive of a number of amendments as we work through this process. I'm really grateful. It's a great committee to be on. I appreciate Chairman Scott being here, and appreciate very much the final product here. And I'm looking forward to supporting not only the rule, but the underlying bill as well. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ranking Member Fox, you can agree or disagree, but in my district, the employers are looking for anybody, trained or untrained. They will train.
Educated or uneducated, you mean?
Educated or uneducated, or trained in their field, whatever the case. I understand what you're getting at, but But they will do the training right on campus. I mean, how many of the welders that they have, you know, they're bringing them in, they will do it while they're receiving benefits and wages. And so I'm struggling with this because what I feel like this bill does is add a lot of bureaucracy and reports that are unnecessary, because when you talk about a community college, when you talk about the employers, as a president, you reached out to those employers. They're doing that on the ground. They're being creative. They understand. I mean, they're facing these issues every single day, and I just feel like, and am I correct? It's $78 billion over 6 years. $78 billion that's being added in this bill.
I think that's right.
Okay, so about $13 billion a year for something that a lot of employers are already doing, to reaching out. And I understand there's some need. There's maybe some specialized need, but
Right.
in general, our employers are doing this. They're reaching out to those schools. And when you said keeping things local, that's where it's best, because those community colleges and those employers have worked together for years. And I think if you're trying to get more people into the workforce, and I will say this, in my district, what I have been told is maybe we shouldn't have sent out so much COVID money, because that would have kept people in the job market. And so I have huge concerns when what we do is sit here and create more and more bureaucracy. Let's do another report on this. And that doesn't get anyone into a job.
You're right.
Well, maybe the guy writing the report, I'm sorry.
Well, what is happening in this bill is 70% of the money is going to the bureaucracy, and only 30% of the money is going directly. Again, I saw that when I was in the community college. It was one education institution scratching another's back, or a community action agency, and it just really upset me that was what was happening. What we propose is that 70% would go directly into helping students gain skills and cut back the bureaucracy to no more than 30%. I think it actually could be cut back more. And so I call this primarily a high-priced bureaucrat bill, because we do get some people out of poverty, but those are people that are going on the government payroll, not in the private sector. And I commend the employers in your district who are taking people in with no skills, or very, very basic skills, and giving them what they need. But some employers don't have that luxury. And so the hope is with WIOA is to give some basic skills to match the people who come in with a provider that can give them some basic skills, so that the employer wants to hire them and then move them on up the ladder. And that's what needs to be done. In most cases, we're not going to give them, they're not going to get the equivalent of a college degree or a 2-year degree, but they're going to be ready to be a value added to the employer. And that's what we want to do.
Well, and Ranking Member Fox, when I see them training the welders, and I use that as an example because that one I most recently saw when I was out touring a group, and that is a wonderful skill and training to have.
And paying $100,000 in some cases immediately.
That is something, and so for them to be able to provide that, and I will say, a lot of those employers are working with the schools in the area to, so that they are fulfilling the certification needs and requirements. Right. So I think that, and as I mention all this, what I think and you mentioned it before, is we got to keep this local. We can't do the one-size-fits-all Washington, D.C. down, because those local communities will be creative. They will think of ways to fill these needs and get people to work. If someone wants to work, they're gonna find a way to make it happen if we step out of their way and let them do it.
And what's needed in Minnesota is not the same as what's needed in Oklahoma or Massachusetts or rural North Carolina.
Exactly. And so I'm just very concerned that as we continue we're not really addressing the issues of getting people back to work with 70%, 78 billion over the next 6 years, and 70% of it going to bureaucracy.
Well, that's in addition to
In
the
addition
other
to it.
money. Yeah.
But, and 70% of it going to bureaucracy just
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense. It doesn't get
Right.
people to work. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Desaulnier?
Another member of the committee.
No, I have nothing to add, Mr. Chairman. I
Thank
yield back.
you. Ms. Ross?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the committee chair and ranking member, my colleagues from North Carolina. Although the American workforce has grown significantly over the past few decades, federal investment in our workers has fallen by 2/3. It's critical that the United States make significant targeted investment in working people to ensure that Americans have the necessary tools for career advancement and upward mobility. Supporting our workforce not only improves the lives of Americans and the quality of goods and services our nation offers, but it also boosts our competitive standing in a rapidly evolving global economy. I'm proud to be co-leading an amendment to this bill with Representative Dean Phillips that would include entrepreneurship training in federally funded one-stop career centers. These public employment offices play an important role in job placement, skills training, and other services for Americans in the labor force. North Carolina has made important investments in statewide partnerships that connect one-stop career centers with businesses throughout the state. NC Works, our state's primary workforce development group, has assisted thousands of North Carolinians with employment services and plays a critical function in strengthening partnerships between businesses, education, and workforce agencies. These programs have a direct, measurable impact on the lives of working people in my home state of North Carolina. It's especially important that we reauthorize the programs in the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act while our nation continues its recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Investing in our workforce is the best way we can ensure that we build a stronger economy that benefits all of our people. I urge my colleagues to support the rule and the underlying legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Neguse? Anybody else have any questions for members of this panel?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Mr. Chairman Scott.
could I make a couple of comments? Nobody asked questions.
Absolutely.
Did want to make a couple of comments.
Sure.
One, let me just start off with a point of agreement that the ranking member and I have, and that is that the decisions on what training gets done really have to be done locally. The jobs available in Southeast Virginia in shipyards are not the same kind of jobs that are needed in Kansas or Chicago or anywhere else. Those decisions have to be made. And in fact, 85% of the money goes to the local boards to make those decisions. And they use that money not to just keep it for administrative expenses, they use it to pay the expenses of actually training the workers. In fact, there's a 10% cap on administrative expenses. There are provisions, a lot has been said about the community colleges. If the Competes Act is enacted as we pass the House with the short-term Pell Grant program, the community colleges will have the ability to do even a lot more than they're doing now. And so we're looking forward to the Competes Act passing with the provisions that allow Pell Grants to be used for job enhancement programs, as well as those programs that lead to a college degree. Right now, if a course does not lead to a college degree, you can't use the Pell Grant, although it could very well lead to a good job. Now, one of the local decisions that can be made is what's called sector training. I've been approached by a member, Marcy Captor from Ohio, that's having many of the auto manufacturing plants closed. But nobody is talking about transferring the workers into working on electric cars. This is an entire sector that needs training, and in that area, that may be an area where you want to have significant investments in the entire sector. Finally, the ranking member pointed, it was a little unclear about how partisan the bill was when it left the House. It was very bipartisan when it came back from the Senate and had overwhelming support in the House. But when it left the House, it was on a very partisan vote. Only a handful of Democrats supported the bill. One of the challenges right now is we've heard the what they call IRAPs, industry which IRAP industry industry recognized apprentice programs. In those the home-based programs that do not have any of the characteristics of the registered apprenticeship programs. Registered apprenticeships are high quality, they have worker protections, and they are nationally recognized. If you're in an apprenticeship program in Virginia, you can go to Seattle, Washington, they know what you can do. Virtually all of the registered apprenticeships leave those apprenticeships for good jobs with very high pay. The IRAPs do not have any of those qualities, and if you're going to put money into apprenticeships, it looks like they put the money into the good programs. IRAPs can be done, but you want to fund the good programs first before you start wasting money on unproven programs. So I just wanted to make those comments before we adjourned.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. There being no other questions, I want to thank the panel. Dr. Fox, Chairman Scott, thank you so much. You are free to go. I'm now going to welcome our next panel to testify on amendments. Honorable Michael Burgess of Texas, Honorable Garrett Graves, Louisiana, Honorable Fred Keller of Pennsylvania. Dr. Burgess, will begin with you since you already have a mic in front of you. And you're on the Rules Committee, so you get.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I have two amendments. The First Amendment, Burgess Amendment number 3. This amendment prohibits the president from declaring an energy emergency, if his average approval rating is below 50%. On his first day in office, President Biden stopped the Keystone XL pipeline, placed an unlawful moratorium on new oil and gas drilling permits on federal lands. The administration's agenda has disincentivized American oil and gas production while simultaneously increasing imports of these products from other countries. Just last week, the Department of Interior canceled an upcoming offshore oil and gas lease sale in Alaska over an apparent lack of industry interest. The president's approval rating, according to several prominent polls, is hovering around 40%. We exist in a country where government is the consent of the governed. I urge that this amendment be made in order to ensure that a president who does not have the support of the American people cannot use an artificial energy emergency as a political tool. Next amendment, number 11. This amendment prohibits the president from declaring an energy emergency unless he also declares an emergency at the southern border for the same period. Mr. Chairman, we do have a crisis at our southern border. It has gotten even greater due to the policies put in place by this administration. To halt this crisis, the administration must enforce existing law, continue building the southern border wall, and reinstate the Remain in Mexico policy. In March, there were over 221,000 encounters along the southern border. We have already reached over 1 million for the fiscal year. Hundreds of thousands of migrants streaming across our border each month will only put pressure on the oil and gas market by increasing demand. If we are in a state of emergency, we are certainly suffering a border emergency as well. This administration cannot pick and choose which emergencies they want to address. They all require urgent attention. I urge this amendment be made in order to require that this administration address the crisis that we've been facing at the southern border, as well as the crisis at the Pine.
Thank you very much. Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to join you today. Henry and Leon McCullum were convicted as teenagers with the death of a child. They were interrogated for hours by investigators and without any opportunity for counsel present. The West Memphis 3 were convicted as teenagers of the 1993 murders of 3 boys in West Memphis, Arkansas. And they were sentenced to 2 life terms. One was sentenced to death. The reason I bring this up is that in both cases, in both the McCullum case and in the West Memphis 3, later on through the Innocence Project, they found out that these folks, through DNA evidence, they weren't guilty. And in the case of the McCullum brothers, they were in prison for 31 years. And finally, DNA evidence let them out, set them free. The West Memphis 3 were convicted, and they were in prison for 18 years. Again, later on, were determined to not be guilty. The reason I bring this up is that this is exactly what this price gouging bill does. It's exactly what it does. It blames somebody else for a crime that they didn't commit. As long as we continue doing this, you know, the real tragedy here related to the McCullum and the West Memphis 3 is that the person who did this, they weren't held accountable because these people were in jail. This bill does nothing but proliferates this false narrative that it's price gouging. Mr. Chairman, this attempts to blame everybody else. Look, I'll tell you, and I'm not the brightest guy in this Congress by any stretch. On January 27th last year, I released a statement saying, get ready for what's coming next. Mark my words. Here's what will happen as a result of these policies. Americans will be paying higher electricity bills at a time when we're already struggling. Gas prices at the pump are going to rise. Airline and bus travel costs will increase. We're going to see a loss in revenue sharing from hurricane protection, flood control, and coastal restoration projects. The cost of transport and delivery of groceries and other products is going to go up and be passed on to consumers. America's dependence on foreign energy sources from countries like China, Russia, Iran, and others will increase. Net global emissions will increase as a result of getting energy from other countries and offshoring of services. Mr. Chairman, I'll say it again. I'm not the brightest person in this body by any stretch, but I could see this coming. Exactly what we're experiencing today. Look, don't take my words for it. The president, he came straight out and said, we're going to stop producing oil and gas. The Interior Secretary said, I'm wholeheartedly against fracking and drilling on public lands. How could anybody be even kind of shocked by what's happening right now? You could see this from a mile away. Don't take my word for it. Don't even take the president or the Secretary of the Interior's word for it. The CEO of Blackstone said that part of the reason why energy prices are so high, that financing of fossil fuel companies is, quote, almost impossible to obtain. The CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, said that the supply of the restriction of supply of hydrocarbons has created energy inflation, and it's not transitory. In fact, it's going to stick around for a long time. Christopher Wood, global head of equity strategy at Jefferies, said that oil price is going to go higher in a fully reopened world because nobody's investing in oil, but the world still consumes fossil fuels. Mr. Chairman, the bill attempts to give authority to the Federal Trade Commission in pursuing price gouging, which is really strange because on August 11th of last year, Brian Deese, who's the director of the National Economic Council, actually sent a letter to the FTC asking them to exercise the very authority that this bill purports to actually provide. Don't take Brian Deese's word for it. The president followed up a few months later and said, yeah, I agree. Mr. Chairman, as long as we continue to proliferate this false narrative that this is caused by the price gouging, we're going to continue to have the constituents that we represent continue to suffer and pay record energy prices. Mr. Chairman, let me give you a few examples. The administration came out and announced that we're going to increase royalty rates by 50%. That's the tax or the fees that are paid to the federal government for producing domestic energy. They're going to increase them by 50%. This Congress, and I want to remind you, Mr. Chairman, members on your side voted for this bill to impose a pipeline fee of up to $10,000 a mile a year. We've had this Department of Labor that's gone out to pension funds, just like the Blackstone and BlackRock CEOs have said, and they said, don't invest in fossil fuels. Don't invest in fossil fuels. The multilateral development banks received guidance from the Department of Treasury telling them again, don't invest in fossil fuels. More recently, we've seen the SEC step out with these environmental and social justice objectives, an area they have zero expertise in, going out and trying to impose further restrictions on companies. At the same time, we've got Democrat lawmakers that are out there asking other countries to increase energy production. We've seen our own White House go to other countries, not just friendly countries. We're talking about Iran, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, going out and asking them to produce energy. Mr. Chairman, we have resources domestically. We have resources domestically. And I really hope they're giving you the production increases because I can't wait to discuss that. I can't wait. This is the only administration in modern history that has not held a lease sale. The only one. How can anybody be shocked by what's happening right now? So look, I'll tell you, Mr. Chairman, if companies are out there price gouging, I'll join you. I'll join you in going after them. I will. But as long as we're out there creating these false narratives and then legislating on them, we're never going to get to actually addressing the problem. This is the highest energy prices that our constituents have seen. The highest price. You can look back at when the Biden administration took over. It was almost immediate. Prices started going up because of that very messaging. And again, look at what BlackRock, look at what Blackstone CEOs are saying. This is really awful. I am committed to working with you all on legislating, on trying to come up with a solution. We've proposed a number of amendments, including things like, I don't know, allowing for domestic energy production. Allowing for domestic energy production, like President Clinton and President Obama did. And ensuring that we actually hold lease sales. We've offered amendments that say, take into consideration all the things that this administration's done that makes them entirely responsible for the price increases that we've seen. We've offered amendments that say, if your energy policies result in greater dependence on or benefiting countries like Iran, Russia, and China, then you can't continue doing these awful policies. And amendments that say that you can't allow for greater dependence in the United States on foreign energy sources. We have those resources right here in the United States. And Mr. Chairman, I know that you're concerned about emissions, and so I remind you, U.S. has lower emissions than these other countries. So Mr. Chairman, I can't wait to have this discussion because it is awful what we're doing to people. This is lying to people, and it's resulting in higher prices. We've got to fix the root cause of this problem. I thank you for the time and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Keller?
Thank you. I think I got it.
Is your mic on?
Yeah, the red light's on. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Cole, members of the committee. We're here to discuss, and my colleague here laid it out so very well, the issue before us, and that is when President Biden was sworn in January of 2021, the national average for price a gallon of gas was $2.38 a gallon, and inflation was 1.4%. Now the national average of gasoline is at an all-time high of $4.48 a gallon, and inflation has shot to a 40-year high of 8.3%. As of today, the statewide average price of a gallon of gas in Pennsylvania, the statewide average is $4.63 a gallon. Two members of this committee represent California, which has an even more staggering average of $5.98 per gallon. Nationally, the price of gas has increased by an average of 88% since President Biden was sworn into office. The inflation rate, 20% of which is directly tied to energy costs, has increased fivefold since the beginning of the Biden administration. The continued narrative that private energy companies are the ones responsible for these increases is false. All we have to do is look at the policies. Unfortunately, the ones footing the bill for these anti-American, pro-foreign energy policies are those who many people in Congress profess to want to help, those who are on low or fixed incomes. These are the people for which we need to be working the hardest to lower these costs. The amendment I've offered is simple. Not only do American energy companies promote and produce clean and efficient energy, and more cleanly and efficiently than any other country in the world. It's helped us reduce our emissions by 22% over the 2005 levels. They do it more safely, better for their employees. They also bolster national security by mitigating reliance on foreign fuel and employing thousands of well-paid, hardworking Americans. This amendment recognizes and supports the only solution to Biden's energy crisis, unleashing American energy. I urge the members of the committee to allow floor debate on the amendment. Again, if anybody is trying to, I would join, as my colleague said, I would join anybody in making sure people aren't taking advantage of the situation. But the Biden administration has created this from day one with the actions from this administration limiting the production of American energy. So thank you, and I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate all of you being here. Mr. Graves, I think you've submitted 4 amendments. They were all just recently submitted. I don't think any of them have gone through legislative council. I think one of them we know is not germane, but we're looking at the others, so we'll get to it. Dr. Burgess, on your amendment, I was trying to Google Burgess Trump to see if I could find a match to see when you objected to President Trump declaring emergencies when his poll numbers were not above 50%. I don't think they ever were above 50%. On March 13th, 2020, when Trump declared a national emergency concerning COVID, his approval rating was, to be generous, 48%. 538 says it was even lower at 42%. I don't even think Fox News had him at 50%. On February 15th, 2019, when he declared a national emergency on the border, his approval rating was only 43%. In fact, Trump's approval rating, I mean, as I said, never ever reached 50%. So would you have also been, I don't recall you being opposed to him declaring those emergencies, those national emergencies, but maybe you have a different standard for President Biden,
Well,
and that's fine.
If the gentleman will yield,
Yeah.
had you proposed those amendments then, perhaps that's something you could have.
Well,
on the
I
record.
wouldn't, because I wouldn't have imposed them on, I opposed what Trump did a lot of time, but not because his approval rating wasn't at 50%. But I mean, a COVID emergency, I think I thought that was a good thing that he declared a COVID emergency.
So allow the amendment to be made in order. We'll see. We'll see where it falls out.
I don't know. I just found it interesting. Anyway, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much. We've had a vigorous discussion over energy prices and policy and the impact. I want to associate myself with both my colleagues' remarks in that respect. But, you know, I took time, having heard a lot of debate this earlier, just went back and looked at something I wanted to share. This is actually from a Reuters article, not exactly a bastion of conservative ideology, but a very reputable news source. This is a 2019 article on energy. And lo and behold, just for the record, I'll say it's U.S. energy shareholders seek to leave behind a lost decade by Louis Kautzkoff and Jessica Resnick. And since we were talking about this industry that gouges everybody and is obscenely profitable, from 2010 to 2019, the S&P 500 gained 180%. The energy index gained 6%. The energy sector's earnings were declined by 14.8% over the course of that decade. All other sectors were up a minimum of 28%. And as a percentage of the stock market, energy stocks fell from 15% to 5%. In other words, there was a pretty brutal decade. Actually, the price of energy fell pretty dramatically, even though in that time frame the United States, or maybe arguably so, moved from the third largest producer in the world to the largest producer in the world, and turned us from being energy dependent to energy independent, where we were actually exporting, if you count fuel products as well as raw crude, more than anybody else in the world. So, or certainly more than we had ever done. So it's a pretty remarkable record. And I agree very much with Mr. Garrett's comments that, look, you pursue stupid policies, you get bad results. And these policies were almost designed to force up the price of crude. And that's just simply the truth. I mean, and it coincides on a map. And there's other factors, no question, what Mr. Putin did that we all condemn, made things bad for wheat, made things bad for oil. It's going to make things bad for metals because Russia's a huge exporter of nickel and a number of others, and they're under sanction. But policy makes a difference, and a policy that emphasized production and independence worked. Policies that are at odds with those two things have driven up prices. That's just, it's almost axiomatic. And again, if I had, I'll get it and actually submit this for the record, Mr. Chairman, because there's an extraordinary chart of the S&P 500 going like this, the energy index funds going down. So, this was an industry that was brutalized for over a decade. Nobody complained about it. So certainly nobody here was very anxious to help them. And so now that they've had some success, everybody, they must be price gouging. That's just simply not the case. Doesn't stand up empirically in any way, shape, or form. So, seeking to get emergency powers to pursue specious charges of manipulation and price gouging, frankly, is more closely related to the upcoming midterm elections than it is to anything else. And again, that's just true. I'm sorry, it is true. So I don't have any questions for my friends. I just want to come in and thank them for, making what I think are really important points that need to be made and arguing from the data. And I commend my friend from Louisiana for making the point, look, if somebody's price gouging, I'll help you go get them. I just don't think there's any evidence of that out there. And as was pointed out in the last panel, there's not. We haven't seen it. The FTC has these kind of powers. But we will get price surges when you pursue bad policies, when you start constricting supply, and then you have the misfortune of something like Ukraine happening. I don't blame that on anybody directly, but, it's not as if we don't know war creates problems in this energy. I mean, 1974 taught us that when, honestly, the Arabs didn't like what we were doing in helping Israel, and so they did an oil embargo, and boom, everything went crazy in this country. It really underlines why we want to be as independent as we possibly can in what's absolutely critical here. And unfortunately, we're pursuing policies, and by vilifying an industry, it's not letting that happen. President of the United States, a candidate for the United States, should not be, quote unquote, declaring war on an industry that employs 10 million Americans and has turned us from being energy dependent into energy independent. That's what the oil and gas industry has done. But that's what the president did when he was running, to appease his own left wing, declare war on an industry. I wouldn't declare war. I'm not always happy with prices in any industry, but I wouldn't declare war on the steel industry because I thought steel prices were too high. I would say, what are the policies we can pursue that would strengthen the industry and increase supply? And I could go industry after industry like it. Why this one is held up to be vilified and undercut is beyond me. And I don't think it will serve the country well in the long run. I am all for renewables. I point this out over and over. My state is one of the top states in America for wind power. Number two, 42% of our, you think a lot of people in Oklahoma would prefer to just do natural gas to do all our electricity? Sure they would. But wind makes a lot of sense for us, and it's something we are very proud to have helped develop and push and continue to devote resources to. But this is a core industry for us, and it's a core industry for this country, and it's been one of the great success stories of the last decade, and arguably the most important geopolitical transformation in our position was moving from energy dependence to energy independence. We ought to be thanking the people that made that possible for us, from the most humble worker to guys on the rigs, to people moving the product, to folks digging pipeline, to people making investments in an industry that was not returning anything for a decade. and yet they're still out there making investments, finding product. It's not like once you get a well, it keeps producing forever. You know, a lot of these wells run out fairly fast in terms of being able to produce commercially profitable energy. I mean, 90% of the wells in my state are stripper wells. They produce less than 10 barrels a day. They're not easy to keep open. And they're not big gushers producing, but people do it, obviously to try and make profit, but also to try and preserve and extend the resource, because I think it's pretty important to the country. So I'm sorry for getting on a soapbox, but I feel pretty strongly when the folks in my part of the world and an industry that I know very well are vilified in the manner in which I hear them routinely vilified. So I do have a question, though, for Mr. Westerman, who came up to the table. Have you? We wait until you go.
Let him testify.
Okay, yeah, I didn't know if he came up, if somehow he was just there.
You don't have a amendment, do you? Okay, so Mr. Weston, you can you can go. Just make sure the mic's on.
Yeah, I apologize. I didn't realize, because he was sitting back there, I didn't know we were.
Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole, members of the committee, thank you for an opportunity to talk about a very important issue in our country. And I know that my colleague, Mr. Graves, has already quoted what President Biden said on the campaign trail about no more drilling. It ends here. It's number one. I guess that meant number one priority. And he seems to be in a position to try to shift blame everywhere you turn around. You know, when I was growing up, my dad always said, when you point your finger, there's three pointing back. And I guess we're all in the business of pointing fingers, but I wish the administration would step back and look at the actions that they've taken. Canceling the Keystone XL pipeline on day one, an all-out attack on leases on federal lands. And it's still those same actions are still happening today. There still hasn't been a lease sale on onshore or offshore federal lands for energy production. Those are the actions that they'll have an effect in the future. As Mr. Cole mentioned, that wells don't continue producing at the same amount. They taper off over time. We're not developing new wells, so we're going to see a lag in production going out into the future. It takes a long time to develop these wells, but the real damage is in the message that's going out to the industry that you're the problem, that you're the enemy, and you shouldn't be doing what you're doing. The very people that are keeping the lights on, that are keeping the cars and the transportation moving, are being vilified, and I'm afraid this bill does that even more. It's an agenda instead of a solution, and what we've proposed are real solutions. And Representative McMorris Rogers and I have included an amendment to it was basically the bill we had about not taking on more Russian energy, the American Energy Independence from Russia Act, where we do proactive things like actually putting a 5-year plan in place offshore, like requiring lease sales, doing things that will actually make a difference, things that will signal to the industry that it's okay to be in this business. And I hope that we will do something that really addresses the problem instead of just pointing more fingers and projecting. Instead of, we need to look at the log in our own eye before we worry about the speck in other people's eyes. And I think we could work together to do something that's actually good for the country, but this bill's not it in its current form, and that's why we've offered this amendment. And I would be glad to answer any questions and yield back.
Two quick questions for Mr. Westerman. First, I understand that the Biden administration announced just last week that they've canceled 3 offshore lease sales scheduled under the current 5-year plan for offshore leasing. The current 5-year plan expires on June 30th of this year, and the administration's not yet issued a new 5-year plan for 2022 to 27. What signal does that send, in your opinion, Mr. Westerman, to the market, to investors, to American energy producers about the future of domestic oil and gas?
But sending a signal that you're not welcome. You're not welcome to do business here anymore, and we're going to put up barriers for you instead of trying to to help you. And again, these are the people, I believe there's about 10 million workers in the United States in the energy industry, and we're telling them that what you're doing is not important, that there's no future in what you're doing. It's sending a signal to investors that this is a dead-end street, and it's just going to make things worse out in the future. You can argue about the pandemic, you can say what happened with Putin, but we're laying the groundwork for a not very bright future ahead by not issuing leases, whether they're offshore or onshore. You know, like I said, President Biden announced that there's going to be a moratorium on leases. A judge said you can't do that, so they offered finally a sale, and then it was challenged in court, and the Biden Justice Department refused to defend that. So here we are, no new leases, and no new leases in the future in sight. And worse than that, we have no plan. No plan. So I would ask, what's the plan? Why can't we at least do a 5-year plan? And you know, no plan is a plan. It's a plan for failure, and that's where we're headed right now.
Just to be clear on one point, I want to make sure I get this right. Because the Biden administration announced the number of offshore lease sales, I think. Will that do anything to kind of reverse?
It will make it worse. This is another shell game. It's good for headlines to say, oh, we're going to do some onshore sales. There were a lot of sales that were ready to go from the previous administration. The Biden administration is going to handpick some that are insignificant to check the box to say that they've met the law, and there's not going to be any energy produced from these. There probably won't even be anybody bid on these sales that they're doing, but they're trying to put something up to make it look like they're doing their job, which again, it's not addressing the issue. There are sales out there that could be released for bids, but the administration knows that if those sales go through, that they'll actually be producing energy off of them.
Okay, thank you very much. You're back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And just, did you check with the parliamentarian on your amendment before you came here?
I did not. I assume you may have.
Yeah, I have, and they're telling us it's not germane. I'm just giving you the report back. Mr. Perlmutter.
I don't even know where to begin. I've had reservations about this particular piece of legislation until you all testified. Now I'm pretty much in support of it because, Mr. Graves, to your point about saying, well, it's all the fault of the administration, that is so far from the truth. And you know as well as I, you've been around the oil patch, I've been around the oil patch. I watched price of oil at about $70 a barrel under Ronald Reagan, and he does a deal with Saudi Arabia and it goes to 10, okay? I watch it stay there and handle all sorts of oil and gas bankruptcies through the course of the 80s and into the 90s. Under Bill Clinton, when the economy finally kicks up, oil starts going up, stays up under George W. Bush until the economy falls apart and goes from $4 a gallon in Colorado down to $1.50 a gallon. Overnight, because the economy fell apart and we went into the recession in the summer of 2008. Stays down. Under Obama, starts coming back up. Under Trump, goes back down, especially when COVID hits. And under Joe Biden, now that the economy is taken off again, and I went through a whole bunch of statistics when the chair and ranking member were here, all of a sudden the price of oil is going back up again. And then you add Ukraine on top of it. Oh no, it's the Biden policies that are causing this to happen. That's not true. That is not true. Now, if your point is you don't think it is that the oil and gas companies are taking advantage of a good economy, reduction in supply because of Ukraine, and demand is up, okay, I could buy that. But then for you all to point the finger at an administration that has built 8.5 million jobs or 9 million jobs since this time last year, the GDP's up 10% since this time last year, Exports are up 17% since this time last year. Well, then I do start wondering, maybe there is somebody manipulating the market and taking advantage. Because you want to point it straight at the administration. You want to have a boogeyman to blame this on. When I was thinking, well, maybe it's just because there's a lot of demand. Supply was down because the price was way down. It's hard to get the supply back overnight. Well, maybe you're right. Maybe there is something going on here. But it isn't the administration. And I was pretty sanguine about this whole thing and mellow about it until the testimony from you three. I'm going to yield back to the chair.
Mr. Chairman, can I respond?
You certainly can respond, because I have a feeling you and I are going to get into an angle here.
Look forward to it. Mr. Perlmutter, don't take my words for it. I quoted some of the top finance, I hesitate to call them experts, but certainly folks that control more investment income than anybody else in the United States. I quoted them. Don't take my word for it. The market signals out of this administration things like this. This is incredible. I'll tell you something else. Representing an area that actually produces, when you make a decision in the offshore, it's at least a 10-year decision. You don't turn that stuff on and off. It's cost prohibitive to do so. You don't do that. And so, look, you can't go through and tell people that we're increasing your fees to the administration by 50%. We're going to charge you a $10,000 a mile per year pipeline fee, and you're going to continue paying the same prices? That's impossible. That's impossible. Look, if this bill was so badly needed, then why did the administration send letters back in 9 months ago saying, hey, do an investigation using your existing authorities? It's been 9 months. What's going on? Where's the evidence? But just as Congresswoman CMR testified in the last panel, this administration's Secretary of Energy, Secretary Granholm, came out and said, we haven't said it's price gouging. We can't find price gouging. I mean,
And that may be true, but it isn't this administration. We were at $40 a barrel about a year and a half ago. $40 a barrel. We weren't much above that under Donald Trump. It had gone up and then it went crashing. Okay? And now we're at $115 a barrel. Now there ought to be somebody who wants to go make that delta between the 40 and the 115, unless there's something bad going on.
I agree. And certainly if prices were out there and if you had a resource, you would be all over it. Here's where the problem.
But it takes a while to ramp up. That was Mr. Cole's point during the first panel.
So when this administration nearly tripled our dependence upon crude oil from Russia, where did that come from? Did Russia wasn't able to just ramp up? Where did that energy come from? The one type of energy, as you probably know, that you can turn on and off a little bit faster, some of the fracking opportunities. That's a little bit easier than the offshore is. But one of the problems is,
Griggs,
please.
Since I handled a lot of oil and gas bankruptcies, I also know when they go out of business, they go out of business. All right, and a lot of companies broke even at $70 a barrel, not $40 a barrel. They went out of business, and it takes a while for that business to come back, even when you have a delta between 40 and 115. So, in my opinion, there's not a lot of, there's COVID that we have to deal with, and there is Ukraine that we have to deal with. You all say it's the president. Our side is saying it's gouging. It may not be either, okay? It may be we went through COVID, then there's a war in Ukraine, and we've chosen not to buy any oil from Russia, which I believe was the absolute right answer. Okay? Well, it's a world market. You know that too. So, trying to figure out which molecule of oil and gas you're getting is another whole story. So, at the end of the day, I'm going to yield back.
Mr. Chairman, our Second Amendment, I'd urge you to take a look at it. I think it potentially addresses a lot of the things that you raised, and we may have something in common there.
All right. Dr. Burgess, do you have any questions yourself?
No, I just appreciate everyone coming and helping us on this. hard decision, and I think all amendments should be made in order.
Okay, we get, Raskin. All set? Okay.
No questions, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Reschnithala.
I do have a lot of questions for these gentlemen, but for the sake of time, Mr. Chairman,
You
this
submit-
kills me
you'll
because
submit
this is
them
a
in
good
writing
group,
and-
and I'm just going to yield back for the sake of time. Thanks.
Ms. Scanlon.
No questions at this time. Thank you.
Ms. Fishbach.
I'm going to yield back, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Desagne. Ms. Ross. Mr. Neguse. Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Yeah, does anybody else have any questions? Seeing none, I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony. I appreciate you being here. Don't agree with everybody, but I respect your point of view and respect your service here, so thank you. Any additional information you have, please leave with the stenographer, or you can submit it electronically. You are excused. Thank you. If you want, you can leave that. Are there any other members who wish to testify on H.R. 7688 and H.R. 7309? Seeing none, this closes the hearing on H.R. 7688 and H.R. 7309. All right, now, at this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee report a closed rule, we need to. Yes, Mr. Chairman, I move the committee report a closed rule for consideration of H.R. 6531, the Targeting Resources to Communities in Need Act of 2022. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Oversight and Reform. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 117-44, modified by the amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee Report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 7309, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2022, under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Education and Labor. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 117-43, modified by the amendment printed in Part B of the Rules Committee Report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides that following debate, each further amendment printed in Part C of the Rules Committee Report, not earlier considered as part of amendments en bloc pursuant to Section 4, shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time before the question is put thereon, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. Section 4 of the rule provides that at any time after debate, the chair of the Committee on Education and Labor or his designee may offer amendments en bloc consisting of further amendments printed in Part C of the Rules Committee Report not earlier disposed of. Amendments en bloc shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Education and Labor or their designees, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part C of the report and amendments en bloc described in Section 4 of the resolution. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of S. 2398, to designate the United States Courthouse and Federal Building located at 111 North Adams Street in Tallahassee, Florida, as the, quote, Joseph Woodrow Hatchett United States Courthouse and Federal Building, close quote, and for other purposes under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided among and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Oversight and Reform and the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 117-45 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit. And finally, the rule provides that House Resolution 1118 is hereby adopted.
Thank you. I don't think your microphone was on. Can you read that one more time? Yes.
May I just ask a procedural question?
Yes.
I'm the new guy. As much as I enjoy hearing Mr. Perlmutter read all of the resolution,
Right.
is it in order to dispense with the reading of the resolution, or is it, or is it tradition?
You can ask unanimous consent to dispense with it next time if you like.
Would that be something that I would get unanimous consent for?
I-
From the staff, I'm getting thumbs
I'm not
up.
sure I would object, but,
But I'm just curious.
you know, we
because-
do it because I think,
Because that's the way we've done it?
yeah, but you can ask unanimous consent to,
Okay.
you know, I'm for that.
I was just curious,
But if you
Mr.
want to
Chair. I'm not
expedite things,
necessarily-
you could do that. I would welcome it,
Okay, I was just.
especially if I'm reading it, right?
I might object, though.
And-
I
and-
reserve my right to object.
No, like
But
I
we
said, I
can.
was just
We-
curious because
we-
and that's why I waited till Mr.
Yeah,
Perlmutter
we
was
can, we can do that.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Just so for future. But before I yield to Mr. Cole, I want to say something that yield to Mr. Neguse. First of all, I just want to say, for the record, this rule deems a resolution that I authored with Dr. Burgess, calling upon medical schools and health training programs to provide meaningful nutrition education. I'm not a doctor, he is, but I've come to learn in my work on hunger and nutrition education, I've come to learn in my work on hunger that nutrition education is an afterthought in many medical school curriculums. Food is medicine, and we can help people live longer, healthier lives if doctors and other medical professionals are trained on how to screen for hunger, where to refer people if they're hungry, and how to use food to help manage and end diet-related diseases. So I don't expect that Dr. Burgess will vote for the rule, but I do want to acknowledge that we are together on this, and I appreciate his help. And let me yield to Mr. Goose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the junior member, the most junior member of this committee, I try to be judicious in how my remarks and when I decide to make remarks on bills that we're considering by the committee. But I felt compelled to make a few remarks regarding one of the bills that we're considering today, and I'll explain why. Senate Bill 2938, which is the bill to designate the United States Courthouse and Federal Building in Tallahassee, Florida, as the Joseph Woodrow Hatchett United States Courthouse and Federal Building. As I know my colleagues are aware, this is a Republican bill. This bill was introduced by Marco Rubio, Florida's senior Republican senator, and it was co-led by the only black Republican in the United States Senate, Tim Scott. The bill passed unanimously out of the United States Senate, and it is an effort to do something that we do quite a bit around here, which is to honor those who have distinguished themselves in a variety of different professions and honored our country through their service. In this case, the individual who we are seeking to honor, that this bill and that the United States Senate has unanimously decided deserves honor, is Joseph Woodrow Hatchett, who was the first black judge on the Florida Supreme Court and a barrier-breaking man of great distinction. He was appointed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals by President Jimmy Carter, and when that appointment came through, he became the first black man ever appointed to a federal appeals court in the Deep South. Now, obviously, I support this bill, and many of my colleagues on the floor will, but as we all know, the reason we're considering this bill in a rule as opposed to on the floor as a suspension bill is because, unfortunately, many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle decided to abandon, and I don't use that word loosely, literally abandon their own co-sponsorship of this bill. There were 10 Florida Republican members of Congress, who co-sponsored this bill. And then when it came to the floor on the suspension calendar, voted against it. And they were joined by 176 other members of the House Republican caucus. Now, I, again, do my best to mute my criticisms of my colleagues and only do so when I think the circumstances warrant it. But the fact that we have to consider this bill in a structured rule as opposed to on suspension should give each member of this committee pause. Because if the new standard is that every member is going to scour the judicial record of any district judge or Supreme Court judge or appeals court judge or individual that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle decide they are going to name a post office in their district after, so that all naming bills have to be considered through structured rules, then I understand that my colleagues have dictated that to be the new rule. If that's not the case, and I guess I'm posing the question literally, but maybe it's a rhetorical question. Maybe that is where we are, and that from here on out, this will be the way that it works in the House. I regret that that's the case. I, for one, have never voted against a naming bill by a Republican member of Congress since the day I was sworn into the Congress 3.5 years ago. And I would hope that my colleagues would give the same courtesy to Senator Rubio and Senator Scott when they decide in their wisdom to honor the first black man ever appointed to the Florida Supreme Court. So with that, I'll be proud to vote for this bill when it comes to the floor. And I offer that cautionary note because I don't want that to become the standard. I respect my colleagues a great deal on the other side of the aisle. I hear a lot about comity and bipartisanship and the need to respect the norms of this institution. The ranking member is so articulate on many occasions. His amendment, which I suspect he'll be making today, in terms of this dispensation with the change to the rule that was made 1.5 years ago, I get it, and I listen to him intently whenever he makes that argument. And I hope that you'll consider that this might be a moment when we can kind of pull back and restore some regular order when it comes to suspension bills. So anyway, I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. I look forward to supporting this bill on the floor. Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the committee provide for separate consideration of H.R. 6858, the American Energy Independence from Russia Act, under a closed rule. Mr. Chairman, it's concerning to see that the Democratic majority, despite Americans all across the country feeling the impact of skyrocketing gas prices, is unwilling to move forward with common sense solutions. Since the bill that we heard testimony on this afternoon is no longer included in this rule, perhaps the Democratic majority recognized that a smokescreen intended to continue the Biden administration's concerning trend of blame shifting is not the appropriate answer. Our constituents sent us to Washington to act, not sit on the sidelines while people back home continue to suffer. Biden administration has proven from day one they remain eager to handicap domestic energy production, no matter what the cost to Americans. In fact, solutions offered by the Democratic majority may lead to higher prices, gas shortages, and continued import of oil from adversarial countries. Mr. Chairman, this motion does not prevent the majority from considering their other priorities, but simply allows the House to consider additional legislation that will empower domestic energy independence and truly provide relief for families paying the cost at the pump. So I urge the adoption of my motion, and I yield back.
I heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? If not, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say no. No.
No.
In opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
It's sort of unclear to me, Mr. Chairman, so on that I'd ask.
Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres.
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter.
No.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Raskin.
Aye.
No.
No, I'm sorry. I voted no.
I like that. Yeah, you can't take it back. Isn't there a rule about that?
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli?
Mr. Morelli is no.
Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Rushenthaler? Aye. Mr. Rushenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments? Hearing none. So the amendment is not agreed to. In the opinion, where were you? What did you say? No, I know. Are there any other amendments? No. So if there are no other questions on the motion by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, all those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes overwhelmingly have it.
I think we were louder, so I would put that to the test.
You would like a vote? Clerk, record a vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres?
Aye.
Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter?
Aye.
Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli?
Morelli, get up.
Morelli.
Mr. DeSaulnier?
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Ms. Ross?
Aye.
Ms. Ross, aye. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse, aye. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Rushenthaler? Mr. Rushenthaler, no. Mrs. Fishbach? Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
How was Mr.
Mr.
Morelli?
Chairman?
Yes. How was Mr. Morelli
Yes.
recorded?
Mr. Morelli is not recorded.
Mr. Morelli?
Mr. Morelli is aye. Thank you.
Mr. Morelli, aye.
Okay. Clerk report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
Motion is agreed. And the motion is agreed to. Ms. Scanlon will handle it for the Democrats.
And Mr. Burgess will handle it.
Okay. And without objection, the committee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair.